Section 14 of Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. Chapter 13. A Respite. Discipulorum inter jubeo plorare cathedras. Blithe and gay was Mr. Bultitude when he opened his eyes on Monday morning, and realized his incredible good fortune. In a few hours he would be travelling safely and comfortably home, with every facility for regaining his rights. He chuckled, though his sense of humour was not large. He chuckled as he lay snugly in bed to think of Dick's discomfiture on seeing him return so unexpectedly. He began to put it down, quite unwarrantedly, to his own cleverness, as having conceived and executed such a stroke of genius as procuring his own expulsion. He remained in bed until long after the getting up bell had rung, feeling that his position ensured him perfect impunity in this, and when he rose at length it was in high spirits, and he dressed himself for a toleration of things in general very unlike his ordinary frame of mind. When he had finished his toilet, the doctor entered the room. "Bultitude," he said gravely, "before sending you from us, I should like to hear from your own lips that you are not altogether without contrition for your conduct." Mr. Bultitude considered that such an acknowledgment could not possibly do any harm, so he said, as indeed he might with perfect truth, that he very much regretted what had passed. "I'm glad to hear that," said the doctor more briskly, "very glad. It relieves me from a very painful responsibility. It may not impossibly induce me to take a more lenient view of your case." "Oh!" gasped Mr. Bultitude, feeling very uncomfortable all at once. "Yes, it is a serious step to ruin a boy's career at its outset by unnecessary harshness. Nothing, of course, can palliate the extreme baseness of your behaviour. Still, from certain faint indications in your character of better things, I do not despair even yet, after you have received a public lesson at my hands, which you will never forget, of rearing you to become, in time, an ornament to the society in which it will be your lot to move. I will not give up in despair. I will persevere a little longer." "Thank you," Paul faltered, with a sudden sinking sensation. "Mrs. Grimstone, too," said the doctor, "has been interceding for you. She has represented to me that a public expression of my view of your conduct, together with a sharp, severe dose of physical pain, would be more likely to effect a radical improvement in your character, and to soften your perverted heart, than if I sent you away in hopeless disgrace, without giving you an opportunity of showing a desire to amend." "It's very kind of Mrs. Grimstone," said Paul faintly. "Then I hope you will show your appreciation of her kindness. Yes, I will not expel you. I will give you one more chance to retrieve your lost reputation. But for your own sake, and as a public warning, I shall take notice of your offence in public. I shall visit it upon you by a sound flogging before the whole school at 11 o'clock. You need not come down till then. Your breakfast will be sent up to you." Paul made a frantic attempt to dissuade him from his terrible determination. "Dr. Grimstone," he said, I should much prefer being expelled, if it is all the same to you." "It is not all the same to me," said the doctor. "This is mere pride and obstinacy, Bultitude. I should do wrong to take any notice of it." I tell you I have great objection to being flogged," said Paul eagerly. "It wouldn't improve me at all. It would harden me, sir, harden me. I cannot allow you to flog me, Dr. Grimstone. I have strong prejudices against the system of corporal punishment. I object to it on principle. Expulsion would make me quite a different being, I assure you. It would reform me, save me. It would indeed." "So, to escape a little personal inconvenience, you would be content to bring sorrow upon your worthy father's grey head, would you, sir?" said the doctor. "I will not oblige you in this, nor, I may add, will your cowardice induce me to spare you in your coming chastisement. I leave you, sir. We shall meet again at 11." And he stalked out of the room. Perhaps, though he did not admit this even to himself, there were more considerations for commuting the sentence of expulsion than those he had mentioned. Boys are not often expelled from private schools, except for especially heinous offences, and in this case there was no real reason why the doctor should be quixotic enough to throw up a portion of his income, particularly if he could produce as great a moral effect by other means. But his clemency was too much for Mr. Bultitude. He threw himself on the bed and raved at the hideous fate in store for him. 10 short minutes ago, and he had been so happy, so certain of release. And now not only was he as far from all hope of escape as ever, but he had the certainty before him of a sound flogging in less than 2 hours. Just after something has befallen us which, for good or ill, we make a great change in our lives, what a totally new aspect the common everyday things about us are apt to wear. The book we were reading, the letter we had begun, the picture we knew, what a new and tender attraction they may have for us, or what a grim and terrible irony. Something of this Paul felt dimly as he finished dressing in a dazed, unconscious manner. The comfortable bedroom, with its nicely toned wallpaper and flowery cretonnes, had become altogether hateful in his eyes now. Instead of feeling grateful, as he surely ought to have been, for the one night of perfect security and comfort he had passed there, he only loathed it for the delusive peace it had brought him. There was a gentle tap at the door, and Dulcie came in, bearing a tray with his breakfast, and looking like a little royalist bearing food to a fugitive cavalier, though Paul did not quite carry out his share of the simple. "There!" she said, almost cheerfully. "I got Mummy to let me take up your breakfast, and there's an egg for you and muffins." Mr. Bultitude sat on a chair and groaned. "You might say thank you," said Dulcie sourly. "That other girl wouldn't have brought you up much breakfast if she'd been in my place. I was going to tell you that I'd forgiven you, because very likely you never meant her to write to you." Dulcie had not been told the sequel to the Davenant episode, which was quite as well for Paul. "But you don't seem to care whether I do or not." "I feel so miserable," sighed Paul. "Then you must drink some coffee," prescribed Dulcie decisively, "and you must eat some breakfast. I brought an egg on purpose. It's so strengthening, you know." "Don't!" cried Paul with a short howl of distress at this suggestion. "Don't talk about the flogging. I can't bear it." "But it's not Papa's new cane, you know, Dick," said Dulcie consolingly. "I've hidden that.
It's only the old one, and you always said that didn't hurt so very much after a little while. It isn't as if it was the horsewhip either. Daddy lost that out riding in the holidays."
"Oh, the horsewhip's worse, is it?" said Paul, with a sickly smile.
"Tom says so," said Dulcie. "After all, Dick, it will be all over in 5 minutes, or perhaps a little longer, and I do think you oughtn't to mind that so much now, after mamma and I have begged you off being expelled. We might never have seen each other again, Dick."
"You begged me off?" cried Paul.
"Yes," said Dulcie. "Daddy wouldn't change his mind for ever so long till I coaxed him. I couldn't bear to let you go."
"You've done a very cruel thing," said Paul, "for such a little girl as you are. You've done an immense amount of mischief. But for you, that letter would not have been found out. You need not have spoilt my only chance of getting out of this horrible place."
Dulcie set down the tray, and, putting her hands behind her, leaned against a corner of a wardrobe.
"And is that all you say to me?"
she said, with a little tremble in her voice.
"That is all," said Paul. "I've no doubt you meant well, but you shouldn't have interfered. All this has come upon me through that. Take away the breakfast. It makes me ill even to look at it."
Dulcie shook out her long brown hair and clenched her small fist in an undeniable passion, for she had something of her father's hot temper when roused.
"Very well, then,"
she said, moving with great dignity towards the door.
"I'm very sorry I ever did interfere. I wish I'd let you be sent home to your papa and see what he'd do to you. But I'll never, never interfere one bit with you again. I won't say one single word to you any more. I'll never even look at you if you want me to ever so much. I shall tell Dipping he can hit you as much as ever he likes, and I shall show Tom where I put the new cane, and I only hope it will hurt."
And with this parting shot she was gone. Mr. Bultitude wandered disconsolately about the upper part of the house after this, not daring to go down, and not able to remain in any one place. The maids who came up to make the beds looked at him with pitiful interest, but he was too proud to implore help from them. To hide would only make matters worse, for as he had not a penny in his pocket, and no probability of being able to borrow one, he must remain in the house till hunger forced him from his hiding-place, supposing they did not hunt him out long before that time. The shouts of the boys in the playground, during their half-hour's play, had long since died away. He heard the clock in the hall strike 11. Time for him to seek his awful rendezvous. The doctor had not forgotten him, he found, for presently the butler came up and ceremoniously announced that the doctor would see him now if he pleased. He stumbled downstairs in a half unconscious condition. The butler threw open 2 doors which led to the schoolroom, and Paul tottered in, more dead than alive, with shame and fear. The whole school were at their places, with no books before them, and arranged as if to hear a lecture. Mr. Blinkhorn alone was absent, for, not liking these exhibitions, he had taken an opportunity of slipping out into the playground, round which he was now solemnly trotting at the double, with elbows squared and head up, an exercise which he said was an excellent thing for the back and lungs. He had a habit of suddenly leaving the class he was taking, to indulge in it for a few minutes, returning breathless but refreshed. Mr. Tinkler was at his seat, wearing that faint grin on his face with which he might have prepared to see a pig killed or a bull fight, and all the boys fixed their eyes expectantly on Mr. Bultitude as he appeared at the doorway. "Stand there, sir," said the doctor, who was standing at his writing-table in an attitude.
out there in the middle, where your schoolfellows can see you."
Paul obeyed, and stood where he was told, looking, as he felt, absolutely boneless.
"Some of those here," began the doctor in an impressive bass, "may wonder why I have called you all together on this, the first day of the week. Most of those who reside under my roof are acquainted with, and I trust execrate, the miserable cause of my doing so. If there is one virtue I have striven to implant more than any other in your breasts," he continued, "it is the cultivation of a modest and becoming reserve in your intercourse with those of the opposite sex. With the majority I have, I hope, been successful, and it is not painful for me to tell, as for you to hear, that there exists in your midst a youthful reprobate, trained in all the arts of ensnaring the vagrant fancies of innocent but giddy girlhood. See him as he cowers there before your gaze, in all the bared hideousness of his moral depravity."
The doctor on these occasions never spared his best epithets, and Paul began to feel himself the very villain.
"A libertine, young in years, but old in everything else, who has not scrupled to indite an amatory note, so appalling in its familiarity, and so outrageous in the warmth of its sentiments, that I cannot bring myself to shock your ears with its contents. You do well to shun him as a moral leper, but how shall I tell you that? Not satisfied with pressing his effusions upon the shrinking object of his precautious affections, the impious wretch has availed himself of the shelter of a church to cloak his insidious advances, and even force a response to them from a heedless and imprudent girl. If," continued the doctor, now allowing his powerful voice to boom to its full compass, "if I can succeed in bringing this coward, this unmanly dallier in a sentiment which the healthy mind of boyhood rejects as premature, to a sense of his detestable conduct, if I can score the lesson upon his flesh, so that some faint notion of its force and purport may be conveyed to what has been supplied to him as a heart, then I shall not have lifted this hand in vain. He shall see whether he will be allowed to trail the fair name of the school for propriety and correctness of deportment in the dust of a pew floor, and sprung my reputation as a preceptor like a church hassock beneath his feet. I shall say no more. I will not prolong these strictures, deserved though they be, beyond their proper limits. I shall now proceed to act. Richard Bultitude, remain there till I return to mete out to you with no sparing hand the punishment you have so richly merited."
With these awful words, the doctor left the room, leaving Paul in a state of abject horror and dread which need not be described. Never, never again would he joke, as he had been wont to do with Dick in lighter moods, on the subject of corporal punishment under any circumstances. It was no fit theme for levity. If this outrage were really done to him, he could never be able to hold up his head again. What if it were to get about in the city? The boys, who had sunk, as they always did, into a state of torpid awe under the doctor's eloquence, now recovered spirits enough to rally Paul with much sprightly humour. "He's gone to fetch his cane," said some, and imitated for Paul's instruction the act of caning by slapping a ruler upon a copybook with a dreadful fidelity and resonance. Others sought to cross-examine him upon the love-letter, it appearing from their casual remarks that not a few had been also honoured by communications from the artless Miss Davenant. It is astonishing how unfeeling even ordinary good-natured boys can be at times. Chawner sat at his desk with raised shoulders, rubbing his hands and grinning like some malevolent ape. "I told you, Dickie, you know," he murmured, "that it was better not to cross me." And still the doctor lingered. Some kindly suggested that he was waxing the cane, but the more general opinion was that he had been detained by some visitor, for it appeared that, though Paul had not noticed it, several had heard a ring at the bell. The suspense was growing more and more unbearable. At last the door opened in a slow, ominous manner, and the doctor appeared. There was a visible change in his manner, however. The white heat of his indignation had died out. His expression was grave but distinctly softened, and he had nothing in his hand. "I want you outside, Bultitude," he said, and Paul, still uncertain whether the scene of his disgrace was only about to be shifted, or what else this might mean, followed him into the hall. "If anything can strike shame and confusion into your soul, Richard," said the doctor, when they were outside, "it will be what I have to tell you now. Your unhappy father is here in the dining-room." Paul staggered. Had Dick the brazen effrontery to come here to taunt him in his slavery? What was the meaning of it? What should he say to him? He could not answer the doctor but by a vacant stare. "I have not seen him yet," said the doctor. "He has come at a most inopportune moment." Here Mr. Bultitude could not agree with him. "I shall allow you to meet him first, and give you the opportunity of breaking your conduct to him. I know how it will wring his paternal heart." And the doctor shook his head sadly and turned away. With a curious mixture of shame, anger, and impatience, Paul turned the handle of the dining-room door. He was to meet Dick face to face once more. The final duel must be fought out between them here. Who would be the victor? It was a strange sensation on entering to see the image of what he had so lately been standing by the mantelpiece. It gave a shock to his sense of his own identity. It seemed so impossible that that stout, substantial frame could really contain Dick. For an instant he was totally at a loss for words, and stood pale and speechless in the presence of his unprincipled son. Dick, on his side, seemed at least as much embarrassed. He giggled uneasily, and made a sheepish offer to shake hands, which was indignantly declined. As Paul looked, he saw distinctly that his son's fraudulent imitation of his father's personal appearance had become deteriorated in many respects since that unhappy night when he had last seen it. It was then a copy, faultlessly accurate in every detail. It was now almost a caricature, a libel. The complexion was nearly sallow, with the exception of the nose, which had rather deepened in colour. The skin was loose and flabby, and the eyes dull and a little bloodshot. But perhaps the greatest alteration was in the dress. Dick wore an old light tweed shooting jacket of his, and a pair of loose trousers of blue serge, while instead of the formerly black-tied neckcloth his father had worn for a quarter of a century, he had a large scarf round his neck of some crude and gaudy colour, and the conventional chimney-pot hat had been discarded for a shabby old wide-brimmed felt wide-awake. Altogether, it was by no means the costume which a British merchant, with any self-respect whatever, would select even for a country visit. And thus they met, as perhaps never since this world was first set spinning down the ringing grooves of change, met father and son before. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14, Section 15 of Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. Chapter 14, An Error of Judgment. The survivorship of a worthy man in his son is a pleasure scarce inferior to the hopes of the continuance of his own life. Spectator. Du bist ein Knabe, sei es immerhin, und fahre fort den Fröhlichen zu spielen. Schiller. Don Carlos. Paul was the first to break an awkward silence. "You young scoundrel," he said with suppressed rage. "What the devil do you mean by laughing like that? It's no laughing matter, let me tell you, sir, for one of us." "I can't help laughing," said Dick. "You look so queer." "Queer? I may look queer. I tell you that I never in my whole life spent such a perfectly infernal week as this last." "Ah," observed Dick, "I thought you wouldn't find it all jam." "And yet you seem to be enjoying yourself too," he said with a grin, "from that letter you wrote. What makes you come here? Couldn't you be content with your miserable victory without coming down to crow and jeer at me?" "It isn't that," said Dick. I thought I should like to see the fellows, and find out how you were getting on, you know." These, however, were not his only and his principal motives. He had come down to get a sight of Dulcie. "Well, sir," said Mr. Bultitude, with ponderous sarcasm, "you'll be delighted to hear that I'm getting on uncommonly well. Oh, uncommonly. Your high-spirited young friends battered me to sleep with slippers on most nights, and, as a general thing, kicked me about during the day like a confounded football. And last night, sir, I was going to be expelled, and this morning I'm forgiven, and sentenced to be soundly flogged before the whole school. It was just about to take place as you came in, and I've every reason to believe it is merely postponed." "I say, though," said Dick, "you must have been going it rather, you know." "I've never been expelled. Has Chawner been sneaking again? What have you been up to?" "Nothing, I solemnly swear, nothing. They're finding out things you've done and thrashing me." "Well," said Dick soothingly, "you'll work them all off during the term, I dare say. There aren't many really bad ones. I suppose he's seen my name cut on his writing table." "No, not that I'm aware of," said Paul. "Oh, he'd let you hear of it if he had," said Dick. "It's good for a swishing, that is. But after all, what's a swishing? I never cared for a swishing." "But I do care, sir. I care very much, and I'll tell you, I won't stand it. I can't, Dick," he said abruptly, as a sudden hope seized him. You haven't come down here to say you're tired of your folly, have you? Do you want to give it up?" "Rather not," said Dick. "Why should I? No school, no lessons, nothing to do but amuse myself, and eat and drink what I like, and lots of money. It's not likely, you know." "Have you ever thought that you're bringing yourself within reach of the law, sir?" said Paul, trying to frighten him. "Perhaps you don't know that there's an offence known as false personation with intent to defraud, and that it's a felony." That's what you're doing at this moment, sir." "Not any more than you are," retorted Dick. "I never began it. I had as much right to wish to be you as you had to wish to be me. You're just what you said you wanted to be, so you can't complain." "It's useless to argue with you, I see," said Paul, "and you've no feelings. But I'll warn you of one thing. Whether that is my body or not you're fraudulently taken possession of, I don't know. If it is not, it is very like mine, and I'll tell you this about it. The sort of life you're leading it, sir, will soon make an end of you, if you don't take care. Do you think that a constitution at my age can stand sweet wines and pastries and late hours? Why, you'll be laid up with gout in another day or two. Don't tell me, sir. I know you're suffering from indigestion at this very minute. I can see your liver. It may be my liver for anything I know is out of order. I can see it in your eyes." Dick was a little alarmed at this, but he soon said, "Well, and if I am seedy, I can get Barbara to take the stone and wish me all right again, can't I? That's easy enough, I suppose." "Oh, easy enough," said Paul with a suppressed groan. "But, Dick, you don't go up to Mincing Lane in that suit and that hat. Don't tell me you do that." "When I do go up, I wear them," said Dick composedly. "Why not? It's a roomy suit, and I hate a great topper on my head. I've had enough of that here on Sundays. But it's slow up at your office. The chaps there aren't half up to any larks. I made a first-rate booby trap, though, one day for an old yellow buffer who came in to see you. He was in a bait when he found the waste-paper basket on his head." "What was his name?" said Paul, with forced calm. "Something like Shells," he said. "He was a very old friend of mine, and I told him he'd lied." "Shellac, my Canton correspondent. A man I was anxious to be of use to when he came over," moaned Mr. Bultitude. "Miserable young cub, you don't know what mischief you've done." "Well, it won't matter much to you now," said Dick. "You're out of it all." Do you mean to keep me out of it forever, then?" asked Paul. "As long as I ever can," returned Dick frankly. "It will be a matter interesting to see what sort of a fellow you'll grow up into. If you ever do grow. Perhaps you will always be like that. You know, this magic is a rum thing to meddle with." This suggestion almost maddened Paul. He made one stride forward and faced his son with blazing eyes. "Do you think I will put up with it?" he said between his teeth. "Do you suppose I shall stand calmly by and see you degrading and ruining me? I may never be my old self again, but I don't mean to play into your hands for all that. You can't always keep me here, and wherever I go I'll tell my tale. I know you, you clumsy rogue. You haven't the sense to play your part with common intelligence now. You would betray yourself directly. I challenge you to deny my story. You know you would. You couldn't face me for 5 minutes. By gad, I'll do it now. I'll expose you before the doctor, before the whole school. You shall see if you can dispose of me quite so easily as you imagine." Dick had started back at first in unmistakable alarm at this unexpected defiance, probably feeling his self-possession unequal to such a test. But when Paul had finished, he said doggedly, "Well, you can do it if you choose, I suppose. I can't stop you, but I don't see what good it would do." "It would show people you were an impudent impostor, sir," said Paul sternly, going to the door as if to call the doctor, though he shrank secretly from so extreme and dangerous a measure. There was a hesitation in his manner, in spite of the firmness of his words, which Dick was not likely to miss. "Stop," he said. "Before you call them in, just listen to me for a minute. Do you see this?" and opening his coat he pulled out from his waistcoat pocket one end of his watch chain. Hanging to it, attached by a cheap gilt fastening of some sort, was a small grey tablet. Paul knew it at once. It was the Garuda stone. "You know it, I see," said Dick, as Paul was about to move towards him. With what object he scarcely knew himself. "Don't trouble to come any closer. Well, I'll give you fair warning. You can make things very nasty for me if you like. I can't help that. But if you do, if you try to score off me in any way, now or at any time, if you don't keep it up when the doctor comes in, I tell you what I shall do. I shall go straight home and find young Raleigh. I shall give him this stone, and I'll tell him to say some wish after me. I don't believe there are many things it can't do. And all I can say is, if you find yourself and all this jolly old school, except Dulcie, taken off somewhere and struck down all at once thousands of miles away on a desolate island, or see yourself turned into a Red Indian or a cab horse, you'll have yourself to thank for it. That's all. Now you can have them all up and fire away." "No," said Paul in a broken voice. For, wild as the threat was, he could not afford to despise it after his experiences of the stone's power. I was joking, Dick. At least I didn't mean it. I know, of course, I'm helpless. It's a sad thing for a father to say, but you've got the best of it. I give in. I won't interfere with you. There's only one thing I ask. You won't try any more experiments with that miserable stone. You'll promise me that, at least." "Yes," said Dick. "It's all right. I'll play fair. As long as you behave yourself and back me up, I won't touch it. I only want to stay as I am. I don't want to hurt you." "You won't lose it?" said Paul anxiously. "Couldn't you lock it up? That fastening doesn't look very safe." "It will do well enough," said Dick. "I got it done at the watchmaker's round the corner for 6 pence, but I'll have a stronger ring put in it somewhere, if I think of it." There was a pause in which the conversation seemed about to flag hopelessly, but at last Dick said, almost as if he felt some compunction for his present unfilial attitude, "Now, you know it's much better to take things quietly. It can't be altered now, can it? And it's not such bad fun being a boy after all, for some things. You'll get into it by and by. You'll see if you don't, and be as jolly as a sandboy. We shall get along all right together, too. I shan't be hard on you. It isn't my fault that you happen to be in this particular school. You chose it, and after this term you can go to any other school you like, Eton or Rugby, or anywhere. I don't mind the expense. Or, if you rather, you can have a private tutor, and I'll buy you a pony, and you can ride it in the Row. You shall have a much better time of it than I ever had, as long as you let me go on my own way." But these dazzling bribes had no influence upon Mr. Bultitude. Nothing short of complete restitution would ever satisfy him, and he was too proud and too angry at his crushing defeat to even pretend to be in the least pacified. "I don't want your pony," he said bitterly. "I might as well have a white elephant, and I don't suppose I should enjoy myself much more at a public school than I do here. Let's have no humbug, sir. You're up and I'm down. There's no more to be said. I shall tell the doctor nothing, but I warn you, if ever the time comes—" "Oh, of course," said Dick, feeling tolerably secure, now he had disposed of the main difficulty. "If you can turn me out, I suppose you will. That's only fair. I shall take care not to give you the chance. And, oh, I say, do you want any tin? How much have you got left?" Paul turned away his head, lest Dick should see the sudden exultation he knew it must betray, as he said, with an effort to appear unconcerned, I came away with exactly 5 shillings, and I haven't a penny now." "I say," said Dick, "you are a fellow. You must have been going it. How did you get rid of it all in a week?" "It went, as far as I can understand," said Mr. Bultitude, "in rabbits and mice. Some boys claimed it as money they paid you to get them, I believe." "All your own fault," said Dick. "You would have them drowned. But you'd better have some tin to get along with. How much do you want? Will half a crown do?" "Half a crown is not much, Dick," said his father almost humbly. "It's a handsome allowance for a young fellow like you," said Dick, rather unkindly. "But I haven't any half-crowns left. I must give you this, I suppose." He held out a sovereign, never dreaming what it signified to Paul, who clutched it with feelings too great for words, though gratitude was not part of them. For was it not his own money? "And now look out," said Dick. "I hear Grim. Remember what I told you. Keep it up." Dr. Grimstone came in with the air of a man who has a painful duty to perform. He started slightly as his eyes noted the change in his visitor's dress and appearance. "I hope," he began gravely, "that your son has spared me the pain of going into the details of his misbehaviour. I wish I could give you a better report of him." Dick was plainly, in spite of his altered circumstances, by no means at ease in the schoolmaster's presence. He stood shifting from foot to foot on the hearth-rug, turning extremely red, and obstinately declining to raise his eyes from the ground. He stammered at last. "You were just going to swish him, weren't you, when I turned up, sir?" "I found myself forced," said the doctor, slightly shocked at this coarse way of putting things, "forced to contemplate administering to him, for his ultimate benefit, a sharp corrective in the presence of his schoolfellows. I distress you, I see, but the truth must be told." "He has no doubt confessed his fault to you." "No," said Dick, "he hasn't though. What's he been up to now?" I had hoped he would have been more open, more straightforward when confronted with the father who has proved himself so often indulgent and anxious for his improvement. It would have been a more favourable symptom, I think. "Well, I must tell you myself. I know too well what a shock it will be to your scrupulously sensitive moral code, my dear Mr. Bultitude." Dick showed a painful inclination to giggle here. "But I have to break to you the melancholy truth that I detected this unhappy boy in the act of conducting a secret and amorous correspondence with a young lady in a sacred edifice." Dick whistled sharply. "Oh, I say," he cried, "that's bad!" And he wagged his head reprovingly at his disgusted father, who longed to denounce his hypocrisy but dared not. "That's bad. He shouldn't do that sort of thing, you know, should he? At his age, the young dog." "This horror is what I should have expected from you," said the doctor, though he was in truth more than scandalized by the composure with which his announcement was received. Such boldness is indeed characteristic of the dog, an animal which, as you are aware, was with the ancients a synonym for shamelessness. No boy, however abandoned, should hear such words of unequivocal condemnation from a father's lips without a pang of shame. Paul was only just able to control his rage by a great effort. "You're right there, sir," said Dick. "He ought to be well ragged for it. He'll break my heart if he goes on like this, the young beggar. But we mustn't be too hard on him, eh? After all, it's nature, you know, isn't it?" "I beg your pardon," said Dr. Grimstone very stiffly. "I mean," explained Dick, with a perilous approach to digging the other in the ribs, "we did much the same sort of thing in our time, eh?" "I'm sure I did, lots of times." I can't reproach myself on that head, Mr. Bultitude, and permit me to say that such a tone of treating the affair is apt to destroy the effect, the excellent moral effect, of your most impressively conveyed indignation just now. I merely give you a hint. You understand." Said Dick, feeling that he had made a mistake. "Yes, I didn't mean that. But I say, you haven't given him a whopping yet, have you?" "I had just stepped out to procure a cane for that purpose," said the doctor, "when your name was announced." "Well, look here, you won't have to start again when I'm gone, will you?" An ancient philosopher, my dear sir, was accustomed to postpone the correction of his slaves until the first glow of his indignation had passed away. He found that he could lay it on with more science, suggested Dick, while Paul writhed where he stood. "Perhaps so. You might forgive him now, don't you think? He won't do it again. If he goes writing any more love letters, tell me and I'll come and talk to him. But he's had a lesson, you know. Let him off this time." "I have no right to resist such an entreaty," said the doctor, "though I may be inclined myself to think that a few strokes would render a lesson more permanent. I must ask you to reconsider your plea for his pardon." Paul heard this with indescribable anxiety. He had begun to feel tolerably sure that his evil hour was postponed sine die. But might not Dick be cruel and selfish enough to remain neutral, or even side with the enemy in support of his assumed character? Luckily he was not. "I'd rather let him off," he said awkwardly. "I don't approve of caning fellows myself. It never did me any good, I know, and I got enough of it to tell." Well, I yield, Richard. Your father has interceded for you, and I cannot disregard his wishes, though I have my own view in the matter. You will hear no more of this disgraceful conduct, sir, unless you do something to recall it to my memory. Thank your father for his kindness, which you so little deserve, and take your leave of him." "Oh, there, it's all right," said Dick. "He'll behave himself after this, I know. And I say, sir," he added hastily, is Dulcie anywhere about?" "My daughter?" asked the doctor. "Would you like to see her?" "I shouldn't mind," said Dick, blushing furiously. "I'm sorry to say she has gone out for a walk with her mother," said the doctor. "I'm afraid she cannot be back for some time. It's unfortunate." Dick's face fell. "It doesn't matter," he muttered awkwardly. "She's all right, I hope." "She is very seldom ailing, I'm happy to say. Just now she is particularly well, thank you." "Oh, is she?" said Dick gloomily, probably disappointed to find that he was so little missed, and not suspecting that his father had been accepted as a substitute. "Well, do you mind? Could I see the fellows again for a minute or two? I mean, I should rather like to inspect the school, you know." "See my boys? Certainly, my dear sir. By all means, this way." And he took Dick out to the schoolroom, Paul following out curiously. "You'll find us all at our studies, you see," said the doctor, as he opened the first baize door. There was a suspicious hubbub and a hum of voices from within, but as they entered every boy was bent over his books with the rapt absorption of the devoted student, an absorption that was the direct effect of the sound the door handle made in turning. "Our workshop," said the doctor airily, looking round. "My first form, Mr. Bultitude. Some good workers here, and some idle ones." Dick stood in the doorway, looking, if the truth must be told, uncommonly foolish. He had wanted, in coming there, to enjoy the contrast between the past and the present, which accounts for a good many visits of old boys to the scene of their education. But, confronted with his former schoolfellows, He was seized at first with an utterly unreasonable fear of detection. The class behaved as classes usually do on such occasions. The good boys smirked, and the bad ones stared, the general expression being one of uneasy curiosity. Dick said never a word, feeling strangely bashful and nervous. "This is Tipping, my head boy," touching that young gentleman on the shoulder, and making him several degrees more uncomfortable. "I expect solid results from Tipping some day. He looks as if his head was pretty solid," said Dick, who had once cut his knuckles against it. "My second boy, Biddlecombe, if he applies himself, he too will do me credit in the world." "How do, Biddlecombe?" said Dick. "I owe you a ninepence. I mean, oh, hang it, there's a shilling for you. Hello, Chowner," he went on, gradually overcoming his first nervousness. "How are you getting on, eh? Doing much in the sneaking way lately?" "You know him?" exclaimed the doctor with naive surprise. No, I don't know him. I've heard of him, you know. Heard of him." Chowner looked down his nose with a feeble attempt at a gratified simper, while his neighbour giggled with furtive relish. "Well," said Dick at last, after a long look at all the old familiar objects, "I must be off, you know. Got some important business at home this evening to look after. The fellows look very jolly and contented, and all that sort of thing. Enough to make one want to be a boy again, almost, eh? Good-bye, you chaps. Ahem, young gentlemen, I wish you good morning." And he went out, leaving behind him the impression that young Bultitude's governor wasn't half such a bad old buffer. He paused at the open front door, to which Paul and the doctor had accompanied him. "Good-bye," he said. "I wish I'd seen Dulcie. I should like to see your daughter, sir, but it can't be helped. Good-bye, and you," he added in a lower tone to his father, who was standing by, inexpressibly pained and disgusted by his utter want of dignity. "You mind what I told you. Don't try any games with me." And, as he skipped jauntily down the steps to the gateway, the doctor followed his unwieldy, oddly dressed form with his eyes, and, inclining his head gravely to Dick's sweeping wave of the hand, asked with a compassionate tone in his voice, "You don't happen to know, Richard, my boy, if your father has had any business troubles lately? Anything to disturb him?" And Mr. Bultitude's feelings prevented him from making any intelligible reply. End of chapter 14, section 15.
Section 16 of Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Okonek. Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. Chapter 15. The Rubicon. My 3 schoolfellows, whom I will trust, as I will adders fanged, they bear the mandate. Paul never quite knew how the remainder of that day passed at Crichton House. He was ordered to join a class which was more or less engaged with some kind of work. He had a hazy idea that it was Latin, though it may have been Greek, but he was spared the necessity of taking any active part in the proceedings, as Mr. Blinkhorn was not disposed to be too exacting with a boy who in one short morning had endured a sentence of expulsion, a lecture, the immediate prospect of a flogging, and a paternal visit, and as before mercifully left him alone. His classmates, however, did not show the same chivalrous delicacy, and Paul had to suffer many unmannerly jests and jibes at his expense, frequent and anxious inquiries as to the exact nature of his treatment in the dining-room, with sundry highly imaginative versions of the same, while there was much candid and unbiased comment on the appearance and conduct of himself and his son. But he bore it unprotesting, or rather he scarcely noticed it, for all his thoughts were now entirely taken up by one important subject, the time and manner of his escape. Thanks to Dick's thoughtless liberality, he now had ample funds to carry him safely home. It was hardly likely that any more unexpected claims could be brought against him now, particularly as he had no intention of publishing his return to solvency. He might reasonably consider himself in a position to make his escape at the very first favorable opportunity. When would that opportunity present itself? It must come soon. He could not wait long for it. Any hour might yet see him pounced upon and flogged heartily for some utterly unknown and unsuspected transgression. Or the golden key which would unlock his prison bars might be lost in some unlucky moment. For his long series of reverses had made him loth to trust to fortune, even when she seemed to look smilingly once more upon him. Fortune's countenance is apt to be so alarmingly mobile with some unfortunates. But in spite of the new facilities given him for escape, and his strong motives for taking advantage of them, he soon found to his utter dismay that he shrank from committing himself to so daring and dangerous a course, just as much as when he had tried to make a confidant of the doctor. For, after all, could he be sure of himself? Would his ill luck suffer him to seize the one propitious moment, or would that fatal self-distrust and doubt that had paralyzed him for the past week seize him again just at the crisis? Suppose he did venture to take the first irrevocable step, could he rely on himself to go through the rest of his hazardous enterprise? Was he cool and wary enough? He dared not expect an uninterrupted run. Had he ruses and expedients at command on any sudden check? If he could not answer all these doubts favorably, was it not sheer madness to take to flight at all? He felt the dismal conviction that his success would have to depend, not on his own cunning, but on the forbearance or blindness of others. The slightest contretemps must infallibly upset him altogether. The fact was, he had all his life been engaged in the less eventful and contentious branches of commerce. His will had seldom had to come in contact with others, and when it did so, he had found means, being of a prudent and cautious temperament, of avoiding disagreeable personal consequences by timely compromises or judicious employment of delegates. He had generally found his fellowmen ready to meet him reasonably as an equal or a superior. But now he must be prepared to see everyone he met a possible enemy, who would hand him over to the tyrant on the faintest suspicion. They were spies to be baffled or disarmed, pursuers to be eluded. The smallest slip in his account of himself would be enough to undo him. No wonder that, as he thought over all this, his heart quailed within him. They say, the paradox-mongers say, that it requires a far higher degree of moral courage for a soldier in action to leave the ranks under fire and seek a less distinguished position towards the rear than would carry him on with the rest to charge a battery. This may be true, though it might not prove a very valuable defense at a court-martial. But, at all events, Mr. Bultitude found, when it came to the point, that it was almost impossible for him to screw up his courage to run away. It is not a pleasant state, this indecision whether to stay passively and risk the worst, or avoid it by flight, and the worst of it is that, whatever course is eventually forced upon us, it finds us equally unprepared, and more liable from such indecision to bungle miserably in the sequel. Paul might never have gained heart to venture, but for an unpleasant incident that took place during dinner, and a discovery he made after it. They happened to have a particularly unpopular pudding that day, a pallid preparation of suet, with an infrequent currant or two embalmed in it, and Paul was staring at his portion of this delicacy disconsolately enough, wondering how he should contrive to consume and, worse still, digest it, when his attention was caught by Jolland, who sat directly opposite him. That young gentleman, who evidently shared the general prejudice against the currant pudding, was inviting Mr. Bultitude's attention to a little contrivance of his own for getting rid of it, which consisted in delicately shoveling the greater part of what was on his plate into a large envelope held below the table to receive it. This struck Paul as a heaven-sent method of avoiding the difficulty, and he had just got the envelope which had held Barbara's letter out of his pocket, intending to follow Jolland's example, when the doctor's voice made him start guiltily and replace the envelope in his pocket. "Jolland," said the doctor, "what have you got there?" "An envelope, sir," explained Jolland, who had now got the remains of his pudding safely bestowed. "What is in that envelope?" said the doctor, who happened to have been watching him. "In the envelope, sir?" "Pudding, sir," said Jolland, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to send bulky portions of pudding by post. "And why did you place pudding in the envelope?" inquired the doctor in his deepest tone. Jolland felt a difficulty in explaining that he had done so because he wished to avoid eating it, and with a view to interring it later on in the playground. He preferred silence. "Shall I tell you why you did it, sir?" thundered the doctor. "You did it because you were scheming to obtain a second portion, because you did not feel yourself able to eat both portions at your leisure here, and thought to put by a part to devour in secret at a future time. It's a most painful exhibition of pure piggishness. There shall be no pocketing at this table, sir. You will eat that pudding under my eye at once, and you will stay in and write out French verbs for 2 days. That will put an end to any more gorging in the garden for a time, at least." Jolland seemed stupefied, though relieved by the unexpected construction put upon his conduct, as he gulped down the intercepted fragments of pudding, while the rest diligently cleared their plates with as much show of appreciation as they could muster. Mr. Bultitude shuddered at this one more narrow escape. If he had been detected, as he must have been in another instant, in smuggling pudding in an envelope, he might have incautiously betrayed his real motives, and then, as the doctor was morbidly sensitive concerning all complaints of the fare he provided, he would have got into worse trouble than the unfortunate Jolland, to say nothing of the humiliation of being detected in such an act. It was a solemn warning to him of the dangers he was exposed to hourly while he lingered within those walls. But his position was still more strongly brought home to him by the terrible discovery he made shortly afterwards. He was alone in the schoolroom, for the others had all gone down into the playground, except Jolland, who was confined in one of the classrooms below, when the thought came over him to test the truth of Dick's hint about a name cut on the doctor's writing table. He stole up to it guiltily, and lifting the slanting desk which stood there, examined the surface below. Dick had been perfectly correct. There it was, glaringly fresh and distinct, not large, but very deeply cut and fearfully legible. R. Bultitude. It might have been done that day. Dick had probably performed it out of bravado, or under the impression that he was not going to return after the holidays. Paul dropped the desk over the fatal letters with a shudder. The slightest accidental shifting of it must disclose them. Nothing but a miracle could have kept them concealed so long. When they did come to light, he knew from what he had seen of the doctor that the act would be considered as an outrage of the blackest and most desperate kind. He would most unquestionably get a flogging for it. He fetched a large pewter ink-pot and tried nervously to blacken the letters with the tip of a quill, to make them, if possible, rather less obtrusive than they were. All in vain. They only stood out with more startling vividness when picked out in black upon the brown-stained deal. He felt very like a conscience-stricken murderer trying to hide a corpse that wouldn't be buried. He gave it up at last, having only made a terrible mess with the ink. That settled it. He must fly. The flogging must be avoided at all hazards. If an opportunity delayed its coming, why, he must do without the opportunity. He must make one. For good or ill, his mind was made up now for immediate flight. All that afternoon, while he sat trying to keep his mind upon long sums in bills of parcels, which disgusted him as a businessman by the glaring improbability of their details, his eye wandered furtively down the long tables to where the doctor sat at the head of the class. Every chance movement of the principal's elbow filled him with a sickening dread. 100 times did those rudely carved letters seem about to start forth and denounce him. It was a disquieting afternoon for Paul. But the time dragged wearily on, and still the desk loyally kept its secret. The dusk drew on and the gas burners were lit. The younger boys came up from the lower classroom and were sent out to play. The doctor shortly afterwards dismissed his own class to follow them, and Paul and his companions had the room to themselves. He sat there on the rough form with his slate before him, hearing half-consciously the shouts, laughter, and ring of feet coming up from the darkness outside, and the faint notes of a piano, which filtered through the double doors from one of the rooms where a boy was practicing Haydn's Surprise from Hamilton's exercise book, a surprise which he rendered as a mildly interjectional form of astonishment. All the time Paul was racked with an intense burning desire to get up and run for it then, before it became too late. But cold fits of doubt and fear preserved him from such lunacy. He would wait. His chance might come before long. His patience was rewarded. The doctor came in, looking at his watch, and said, "I think these boys have had enough of it, Mr. Tinkler, eh? You can send them out now till tea time." Mr. Tinkler, who had been entangling himself frightfully in intricate calculations upon the blackboard without making a single convert, was only too glad to take advantage of the suggestion, and Paul followed the rest into the playground with a sense of relief. The usual chevy was going on there, with more spirit than usual, perhaps, because the darkness allowed of practical jokes and surprises, and offered great facilities for paying off old grudges with secrecy and dispatch. And as the doctor had come to the door of the greenhouse and was looking on, the players exerted themselves still more, till the prison, to which most of one side had been consigned by being run down and touched by their fleeter enemies, was filled with a long line of captives holding hands and calling out to be released. Paul, who had run out vaguely from his base, was promptly pursued and made prisoner by an unnecessarily vigorous thump in the back, after which he took his place at the bottom of the line of imprisoned ones. But the enemy's spirit began to slacken. One after another of the players, still left to the opposite side, succeeded in outrunning pursuit and touching the foremost prisoner for the time being, so as to set him free by the rules of the game. The doctor went in again, and the enemy relapsed, as usual, into total indifference, so that Paul, without exactly knowing how, soon found himself the only one left in jail, unnoticed, and apparently forgotten. He could not see anything through the darkness, but he heard the voices of the boys disputing at the other side of the playground. He looked round. At his right was the indistinct form of a large laurel bush. Behind that he knew was the playground gate. Could it be that his chance had come at last? He slipped behind the laurel and waited, holding his breath. The dispute still went on. No one seemed to have noticed him. Probably the darkness prevented all chance of that. He went on tiptoe to the gate. It was not locked. He opened it very carefully a little way. It was forbearing enough not to creak, and the next moment he was outside, free to go where he would. Escape, after all, was simple enough when he came to try it. He could hardly believe at first that he was really free at last. Free with money enough in his pocket to take him home, with the friendly darkness to cover his retreat. Free to go back and confront Dick on his own ground, and, by force or fraud, get the Garuda stone into his own hands once more. As yet he never doubted that it would be easy enough to convince his household, if necessary, of the truth of his story, and enlist them one and all on his side. All that he required, he thought, was caution. He must reach the house unobserved, and wait and watch, and the deuce would be in it if the stone were not safe in his pocket again before 12 hours had gone by. All this time he was still within 100 yards or so of the playground wall. He must decide upon some particular route, some definite method of ordering his flight. To stay where he was any longer would clearly be unwise, yet where should he go first? If he went to the station at once, how could he tell that he should be lucky enough to catch a train without having to wait long for it, and unless he did that, he would almost certainly be sought for first on the station platform, and might be caught before a train was due. At last, with an astuteness he had not suspected himself of possessing, which was probably the result of the harrowing experiences he had lately undergone, he hit upon a plan of action. "I'll go to a shop," he thought, "and change this sovereign, and ask to look at a timetable. Then, if I find I can catch a train at once, I'll run for it. If one's not due for some time, I can hang about near the station till it comes in." With this intention, he walked on towards the town till he came to a small terrace of shops, when he went into the first, which was a stationer's and toy dealer's, with a stock in trade of cheap wooden toys and incomprehensible games, drawing slates, penny packets of stationery, and cards of pen and pencil holders, and a particularly stuffy atmosphere. The proprietor, a short man with a fat white face with a rich glaze all over it, and a fringe of ragged brown whisker meeting under his chin, was sitting behind the counter, posting up his ledger. Paul looked round the shop in search of something to purchase, and at last said, more nervously than he expected to do, "I want a pencil case, one which screws up and down." He thought a pencil case would be an innocent, unsuspicious thing to ask for. The man set rows of cards containing pencil cases of every imaginable shape on the counter before him, and when Mr. Bultitude had chosen and paid for one, the stationer asked if there would be anything else, and if he might send it for him. "You're one of Dr. Grimstone's young gentlemen up at the Crichton house, aren't you, sir?" he added. A guilty dread of discovery made Paul anxious to deny this at once. "No," he said. "Oh, no. No connection with the place. Could you allow me to look at a timetable?" "Certainly, sir. Expectin' someone tonight or tomorrow, perhaps?" "Let me see," he said, consulting a table which hung behind him. "There's a train from Pancras comes in half an hour from now. 6:05, that is. There's another due at 8:15, and one at 9:30. Then from Liverpool Street they run—" "Thank you," said Mr. Bultitude, but I want the up trains." "Ah," said the man, with a rather peculiar intonation. "I thought maybe your pa or ma was coming down. Ain't Dr. Grimstone got the time the trains go?" "Yes," said Paul desperately, without very well knowing what he said. "Yes, he has, but not for this month. He sent me to inquire." "Did he, though?" said the stationer. "I thought you wasn't one of his young gentlemen." Mr. Bultitude saw what a fearful trap he had fallen into, and stood speechless. "Go along with you," said the little stationer at last, with a not unkindly grin. "Lord bless you, I knew your face the minute you come in. To go and tell me a brazen story like that. You're a young pickle, you are." Mr. Bultitude began to shuffle feebly towards the door. "Pickle, eh?" he protested in great discomposure. "No, no, heaven knows I'm no pickle. It's of no consequence about those trains. Don't trouble. Good evening to you." "Stop," said the man. "Don't be in such a hurry now. You tell me what you want to know straightforward, and I don't mean to say as I won't help you so far as I can. Don't be afraid of my telling no tales. I've been a schoolboy myself in my time, bless your heart. I shouldn't wonder now if I couldn't make a pretty good guess without telling at what you're after. You've been a-catching of it hot, and you want to make a clean bolt of it. I ain't very far off now, am I?" "No," said Paul, for something in the man's manner inspired confidence. "I do want to make a bolt of it. I've been most abominably treated." "Well, look here, I ain't got no right to interfere. And if you're caught, I look to you not to bring my name in. I don't want to get into trouble up at Crichton House and lose good customers, you see. But I like the looks of you, and you've always dealt there pretty regular. I don't mind if I give you a lift. Just see here. You want to get off to London, don't you? What for is your business, not mine. Well, there's a train, express, stops at only one station on the way, in at 5:50. It's 20 minutes to 6 now. If you take that road just opposite, it'll bring you out at the end of the station road. You can do it easy in 10 minutes and have time to spare. So cut away, and good luck to you." "I'm vastly obliged to you," said Paul, and he meant it. It was a new experience to find anyone offering him assistance. He left the close little shop, crossed the road, and started off in the direction indicated to him at a brisk trot. His steps rang out cheerfully on the path, iron-bound with frost. He was almost happy again, under the exhilarating glow of unusual exercise and the excitement of escape and regained freedom. He ran on, past a series of villa residences enclosed in varnished palings and adorned with that medieval abundance of turrets, balconies, and cheap stained glass which is accepted nowadays as a guarantee of the tenant's culture, and a satisfactory substitute for effective drainage. After the villas came a church, and a few yards farther on the road turned with a sharp curve into the main thoroughfare leading to the station. He was so near it that he could hear the shrill engine whistles, and the banging of trucks on the railway sidings echoed sharply from the neighboring houses. He was saved, in sight of haven at last. Full of delight at the thought, he put on a still greater pace, and turning the corner without looking, ran into a little party of 3, which was coming in the opposite direction. Fate's vein of irony was by no means worked out yet. As he was recovering from the collision and preparing to offer or accept an apology, as the case might be, he discovered to his horror that he had fallen amongst no strangers. The 3 were his old acquaintances, Coker, Coggs, and the virtuous Chawner, of whom he had fondly hoped to have seen the last forever. The moral and physical shock of such an encounter took all Mr. Bultitude's remaining breath away. He stood panting under the sickly rays of a street lamp, the very incarnation of helpless, hopeless dismay. "Hullo," said Coker, "it's young Bultitude." "What do you mean by cannoning into a fellow like this?" said Coggs. "What are you up to out here, eh?" "If it comes to that," said Paul, casting about for some explanation of his appearance, "what are you up to here?" "Why," said Chawner, "if you want to know, Dick, we've been to fetch the St. James Gazette for the doctor. He said I might go if I liked, and I asked for Coker and Coggs to come too, because there was something I wanted to tell them, very important. And I have told them, haven't I, Corny?" Coggs growled sulkily. Coker gave a tragic groan and said, "I don't care when you tell, Chawner. Do it tonight if you like. Let's talk about something else. Bultitude hasn't told us yet how he came out here after us." His last words suggested a pretext to Paul, of which he hastened to make use. "Oh," he said, I came out here after you, to say that Dr. Grimstone will not require the St. James Gazette. He wants the Globe and the Star instead." It did not sound a very probable combination, but Paul used the first names that occurred to him, and as it happened, aroused no suspicions, for the boys read no newspapers. "Well, we've got the other now," said Coker. We shall have to go back and get the fellow at the bookstall to change it, I suppose. Come on, you fellows." This was at least a move in the right direction, for the three began at once to retrace their steps. But, unfortunately, all these explanations had taken time, and before they had gone many yards, Mr. Bultitude was horrified to hear the station bell ring loudly, and immediately after a cloud of white steam rose above the station roof as the London train clanked cumbrously in, and was brought to with a prolonged screeching of brakes. The others were walking very slowly. At the present pace, it would be almost impossible to reach the train in time. He looked round at them anxiously. "Hadn't we better run, don't you think?" he asked. "Run?" said Coker scornfully. "What for? I'm not going to run. You can, if you like." "Why, really," said Paul briskly, very grateful for the permission. "Do you know, I think I will." And run he did, with all his might, rushing headlong through the gates, threading his way between the omnibuses and under the Roman noses of the mild fly-horses in the enclosure, until at length he found himself inside the little booking office. He was not too late. The train was still at the platform, the engine getting up steam with a dull roar. But he dared not risk detection by traveling without a ticket. There was time for that, too. No one was at the pigeonhole but one old lady. But, unhappily, the old lady considered taking a ticket as a solemn rite to be performed with all due caution and deliberation. She had already catechized the clerk upon the number of stoppages during her proposed journey, and exacted earnest assurances from him that she would not be called upon to change anywhere in the course of it. And as Paul came up, she was laying out the purchase money for her ticket upon the ledge and counting it, which, the fare being high and the coins mostly halfpence, seemed likely to take some time. "One moment, man, if you please," cried Mr. Bultitude, panting and desperate. "I'm pressed for time." "Now you've gone and put me out, little boy," said the old lady fussily. "I shall have to begin all over again. Young man, will you take and count the other end and see if it adds up right? There's a halfpenny wrong somewhere. I know there is." "Now then," shouted the guard from the platform. "Any more going on?" "I'm going on," said Paul. "Wait for me. First single to St. Pancras. Quick." "Drat the boy," said the old lady angrily. "Do you think the world's to give way for you? Such impudence! Mind your manners, little boy, can't you? You've made me drop a threepenny bit with your scrounging." "First single, 5 shillings," said the clerk, jerking out the precious ticket. "Right!" cried the guard at the same instant. "Stand back there, will you?" Paul dashed toward the door of the booking office, which led to the platform. But just as he reached it, a gate slammed in his face with a sharp click. Through the bars of it he saw, with hot eyes, the tall, heavy carriages which had shelter and safety in them jolt heavily past, till even the red lamp on the last van was quenched in the darkness. That miserable old woman had shattered his hopes at the very moment of their fulfillment. It was fate again. As he stood, fiercely gripping the bars of the gate, he heard Cog's hateful voice again. "Hello, so you haven't got the Globe and the other thing after all, then? They've shut you out?" "Yes," said Mr. Bultitude in a hollow voice. "They've shut me out." End of section 16. Recording by Mike Okonek.
Section 17 of Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. Chapter 16. Hard Pressed. Part 1. Mark the poor wretch, to overshoot his troubles, how he outruns the wind, and with what care he cranks and crosses with 1,000 doubles. The many musets through which he goes are like a labyrinth to amaze his foes. As soon as the gate was opened, Paul went through mechanically with the others onto the platform, and waited at the bookstall while they changed the paper. He knew well enough that what had seemed at the time a stroke of supreme cunning would now only land him in fresh difficulties, if indeed it did not lead to the detection of his scheme. But he dared not interfere and prevent them from making the unlucky exchange. Something seemed to tie his tongue, and in sullen, leaden apathy he resigned himself to whatever might be in store for him. They passed out again by the booking office. There was an old lady still at the pigeonhole, trying to persuade the much enduring clerk to restore a lucky sixpence she had given him by mistake, and was quite unable to describe. Mr. Bultitude would have given much just then to go up and shake her into hysterics, or curse her bitterly for the mischief she had done, but he refrained, either from an innate chivalry or from a feeling that such an outburst would be ill-judged. So, silent and miserable, with slow step and hanging head, he set out with his jailers to render himself upon once more at his house of bondage, a sort of involuntary Regulus without the oath. "Dickie, you are very anxious to run just now," observed Chawner, after they had gone some distance on their homeward way. "We were late for tea, explained Paul hastily. "If you think the tea's worth racing like that for, I don't," said Coggs viciously. "It's muck." "You don't catch me racing except for something worth having," said Coker. One more flash of distinct inspiration came to Paul's aid in the very depths of his gloom. It was, in fact, a hazy recollection from English history of the ruse by which Edward I, when a prince, contrived to escape from his captors at Hereford Castle. Why," he said excitedly, "would you race if you had something worth racing for? Hey, would you now?" "Try us," said Coker emphatically. "What do you call something?" inquired Chawner suspiciously. "Well," said Mr. Bultitude, "what do you say to a shilling?" "You haven't got a shilling," objected Coggs. "Here's a shilling, see?" said Paul, producing one. "Now then, I'll give this to any boy I see get into tea first." "Bultitude thinks he can run," said Coker, with an amiable unbelief in any disinterestedness. "He means to get in first and keep the shilling himself, I know." "I'll back myself to run him any day," put in Coggs. "So will I," added Chawner. "Well, is it agreed?" Paul asked anxiously. "Will you try?" "All right," said Chawner. "You must give us a start to the next lamppost, though. You stay here, and when we're ready we'll say 'off.'" They drew a line on the path with their feet to mark Paul's starting point, and went on to the next lamp. After a moment or two of anxious waiting, he heard Coggs shout all in one breath, "1, 2, 3, off!" and the sound of scampering feet followed immediately. It was the most exciting and hotly contested race. Paul saw them for one brief moment in the lamplight. He saw Chawner scudding down the path like some great camel, and Coker squaring his arms and working them as if they were wings. Coggs seemed to be last. He ran a little way himself, just to encourage them, but as the sound of their feet grew fainter and fainter, he felt that his last desperate ruse had taken effect, and with a chuckle at his own cleverness, turned round and ran his fastest in the opposite direction. He felt little or no interest in the result of the race. Once more he entered the booking office, and kneeling on a chair, consulted the time board that hung on the wall over the sheaf of texts and the missionary box. The next train was not until 7:25. A whole hour and 25 minutes to wait. What was he to do? Where was he to pass the weary time till then? If he lingered on the platform, he would assuredly be recaptured. His absence could not remain long undiscovered, and the station would be the first place they would search for him. And yet he dared not wander away from the neighborhood of the station. If he kept to the shops and lighted thoroughfares, he might be recognized or traced. If, on the other hand, he went out farther into the country, which was utterly unknown to him, he had no watch, and it would be only too easy to lose his way or miscalculate time and distance in the darkness. To miss the next train would be absolutely fatal. He walked out upon the platform and on past the refreshment and waiting rooms, past the weighing machine, the stacked trucks, and the lamp room, meeting and seen by no one. Even the boy at the bookstall was busy with bread and butter and a mug of tea in a dark corner, and never noticed him. He went on to the end of the platform, where the planks sloped gently down to a wilderness of sheds, coaling stages, and sidings. He could just make out the bulky forms of some tarpaulined cattle vans and open coal trucks standing on the lines of metal which gleamed in the scanty gaslights. It struck him that one of these vans or trucks would serve his purpose admirably, if he could only get into it, and very cautiously he picked his way over the clogging ballast and rails till he came to a low, narrow strip of platform between two sidings. He mounted it and went on till he came to the line of trucks and vans drawn up alongside. The vans seemed all locked, but at the end he found an empty coal wagon in which he thought he could manage to conceal himself and escape pursuit till the longed-for 7:25 train should arrive to relieve him. He stepped in and lay down in one corner of it, listening anxiously for any sound of search, but hearing nothing more than the dismal dirge of the telegraph wires overhead. He soon grew cold and stiff, for his enforced attitude was far from comfortable, and there was more coal dust in his chosen retreat than he could have wished. Still, it was secluded enough. It was not likely that it would occur to anyone to look for him there. 10 days ago, Mr. Paul Bultitude would have found it hard to conceive himself lying down in a hard and grimy coal truck to escape his son's schoolmaster. But since then he had gone through too much that was unprecedented and abnormal to see much incongruity in his situation. It was all too hideously real to be a nightmare. But even here he was not allowed to remain undisturbed. After about half an hour, when he was beginning to feel almost secure, there came a sharp twanging of wires beneath, and 2 short strokes of a bell in the signal box hard by. He heard someone from the platform, probably the station master, shout, "Look alive there, Ing, picking stones, some of you. There, those 3 trucks on the A siding to go to Slopesbury by the 6:30 luggage. She'll be in another 5 minutes." There were steps, as if some persons were coming out of a cabin opposite. They came nearer and nearer. "These 3, ain't it, Tommy?" said a gruff voice close to Paul's ear. "That's it, mate," said another, evidently Tommy's. "Get 'em along up to the point there. Can't have the 6:30 standing about on this 'ere line all night 'cause of the limited. Now then, all together, shove. They've got the old horse on the other end." And to Paul's alarm he felt the truck in which he was begin to move ponderously on the greasy metals and strike the next with its buffers with a jarring shock and a jangling of coupling chains. He could not stand this unless he revealed himself at once, or managed to get out of this delusive wagon. The 6 whatever it was train would be up and carry him off to Slopesbury, 100 miles or so farther from home. They would have time to warn Dick, and he would be expected. Ambushes laid for him, and his one chance would be gone forever. There was a whistle far away down the line, and that humming vibration which announces an approaching train. Not a moment to lose. He was afraid to attempt the leap from the moving wagons, and resolved to risk all and show himself. With this intention, he got upon his knees, and putting his head above the dirty bulwark, looked over and said softly, "Tommy, I say, Tommy." A porter, who had been laboriously employed below, looked up with a white and scared face and staggered back several feet. Mr. Bultitude, in a sudden panic, ducked again. "Bill," Paul heard the porter say hoarsely, "I'll take my Bible oath I've never touched a drop this week, not to speak of, but I got 'em again, Bill. I got 'em again." "Got what again?" growled Bill. "What's the matter now?" "It's the jumps, Bill," gasped the other. "The oars. They've got me, and no mistake. As I'm a living man, as I was shoving on that there truck, I saw an imp, a ghastly imp, Bill, stick its ugly head over the side and say, 'Tommy,' it says, just like that. It says, 'Tommy, I wants you.' I durst go near it, Bill. I'll get leave and go home and lay up. It glared at me so horrid, Bill, and grinned. Ugh, I'll take the pledge after this here, I will. I'll go to chapel Sundays regular." "Let's see if there ain't something there first," said the practical Bill. "Easy with the horse up there. Now then." He stepped on the box of the wheel and looked in. "Get out of this, whatever you are. We don't contract to carry no imps on this line. Well, if I ever. Tommy, old man, it's all right. You ain't got him this time. Here's your imp." And reaching over, he hauled out the wretched Paul by the scruff of his neck in a state of utter collapse, and deposited him on the ground before him. "That ain't your private carriage, you know that ain't. There wasn't no bed made up for you there. That I know on. You ain't after no good. Now, you're a vagabond. That's about your size, I can see. What do you mean by it, eh?" "Shut your head, Bill, will you?" said Tommy, whose relief probably softened his temper. "This here's a young gent." "Young gent or no young gent," replied Bill sententiously, "he's no call to go idling in our wagon and give us hard-working men a turn. Hold him tight, Tommy. Here's the luggage down on us." Tommy held him fast with a grip of iron, while the other porters coupled the trucks, and the luggage train lumbered away with its load. After this the men slouched up and stood round their captive, staring at him curiously. "Look here, my men," said Paul, "I've run away from school. I want to go on to town by the next train, and I took the liberty of hiding in the truck, because the schoolmaster will be up here very soon to look for me. You understand?" "I understand," said Bill, "and a nice young party you are." I don't want to be caught," said Paul. "Naturally," assented Tommy sympathetically. "Well, can't you hide me somewhere where he won't see me? Come on, you can do that." "What do you say, Bill?" asked Tommy. "What will the governor say?" said Bill dubiously. "I've got a little money," urged Paul. "I'll make it worth your while." "Why didn't you say that afore?" said Bill. "The governor needn't know." "Here's a half sovereign between you," said Paul, holding it out. "That's something like an imp," said Tommy warmly. "If all bogies acted as handsome as this 'ere, I don't care how often they'd show themselves. We'll have a supper on this, mates, and drink young delirium tremens's jolly good health. You come along with me, young shaver. I'll stow you away right enough and let you out when your train comes in." He led Paul onto the platform again and opened a sort of cupboard or closet. "That's where we keeps the brooms and lamp rags and them," he said. "It ain't what you may call tidy, but if I lock you in no one won't trouble you." It was perfectly dark, and the rags smelt unpleasantly, but Mr. Bultitude was very glad of this second ark of refuge, even though he did bruise his legs over the broom handles. He was gladder still by and by when he heard a rapid, heavy footfall outside, and a voice he knew only too well, saying, "I want to see the station master. Ha, there he is. Good evening, station master. You know me, Dr. Grimstone of Crichton House. I want you to assist me in a very unpleasant affair. The fact is, one of my pupils has had the folly and wickedness to run away." "You don't say so," said the station master. "It's only too true, I'm sorry to say. He seemed happy and contented enough, too. It's a black, ungrateful business, but I must catch him, you know. He must be about here somewhere, I feel sure. You don't happen to have noticed a boy who looked as if he belonged to me? They can't tell me at the booking office." How glad Paul was now he had made no inquiries of the station master. "No," said the latter, "I can't say I have, sir, but some of my men may have come across him. I'll inquire. Here, Inge, I want you. This gentleman here has lost one of his boys. Have you seen him?" "What sort of young gentleman was he to look at?" Paul heard Tommy's voice ask. "A bright, intelligent looking boy," said the doctor. "Medium height, about 13, with auburn hair." "No, I ain't seen no intelligent boys with medium height," said Tommy slowly. "Not leastways to speak to positive. What might he have had on beside his auburn hair?" "Black cloth jacket with a wide collar," was the answer. "Grey trousers, and a cloth cap with a leather peak." "Oh," said Tommy, "then I see him." "When? Where?" "'Bout half an hour since." "Do you know where he is now?" "Well," said Tommy, to Paul's intense horror, for he was listening, quaking to every word of this conversation, which was held just outside his cupboard door. "I dare say I could give a guess if I give my mind to it." "Out with it, Inge, now, if you know no tricks," said the station master, who had apparently just turned to go away. "Excuse me, sir, but I've some matters in there to see after." When he had gone, the doctor said rather heatedly, "Come on, you're keeping something from me. I will have it out of you. If I find you have deceived me, I'll write to the manager and get you sent about your business. You'd better tell me the truth." "You see," said Tommy, very slowly and reluctantly, "that young gent of yourn was a gent." "I tried my very best to render him so," said the doctor stiffly. "Here is the result. How did you discover he was one, pray?" "'Cause he acted like a gent," said Tommy. "He took and give me half a sovereign." "Well, I'll give you another," said the doctor, "if you can tell me where he is." "Thankee, sir. Don't you be afraid. You're a gent right enough, too, though you do happen to be a schoolmaster." "Where is the unhappy boy?" interrupted the doctor. "Seems as if I was a roundin' on him, like, don't it almost, sir?" said Tommy, with too evident symptoms of yielding in his voice. Paul shook so in his terror that he knocked down a broom or two with a clatter which froze his blood. "Not at all," said the doctor. "Not at all, my good fellow. You're advancing the cause of moral order." "Oh," said Tommy, obviously open to conviction. "Well, if I'm doing all that, I can't go for wrong, can I? And after all, we mayn't like schools or schoolmasters, not over above, but we can't get on without 'em, I s'pose." "But look ye here, sir, if I goes and tells you where you can get a hold of this here boy, you won't go and wallop him now, will you?" "I can't make no bargains," said the doctor. "I shall act on my own discretion." "That's it," said Tommy, unaccountably relieved. "Spoke like a merciful Christian gentleman. If you don't go acting on nothing more nor your discretion, you can't hurt him much, I take it. Well, then, since you've spoke out fair, I don't mind putting you on his track like." If the door of the cupboard had not been locked, Paul would undoubtedly have burst out and yielded himself up to escape the humiliation of being sold like this by a mercenary and treacherous porter. As it was, he had to wait till the inevitable words should be spoken. "Well, you see," went on Tommy very slowly, as if struggling with the remnants of a conscience, "it was like this here. He comes up to me and says, 'You're young gentleman, I mean,' says he, 'Porter, I wants to hide. I've run away.' And I says to him, says I, 'It ain't no use hanging about here,' I says, ''cause if you do, your governor,' meaning no offense to you, sir, 'will be coming up and catching ye on the top.' 'Right you are, Porter,' says he to me. 'What do you advise?' he says. 'Well,' I says, 'I don't know as I'm right in giving you no advice at all, having run away from them as has the care on you,' I says, 'but if I was a young gentleman and didn't want to be catched, I should walk on to Dufferton. It ain't only 3 miles or so, and you'll have time to do it before the up train comes along there.' 'Thankee, Porter,' he says, 'I'll do that,' and away he bolts, and for anything I know he's halfway there by this time." "A fly!" shouted the doctor excitedly, when Tommy had come to the end of his veracious account. "I'll catch that young rascal now. Who has a good horse? Davis, I'll take you. 5 shillings if you reach Dufferton before the up train. Take the—" The rest was lost in the banging of the fly door and the rumble of wheels. The terrible man had been got safely off on the wrong scent, and Paul fell back amongst the lumber in his closet, faint with the suspense and relief. Presently he heard Tommy's chuckling whisper through the keyhole, "Are you all right in there, sir? He's safe enough now, off on a pretty dance. You don't think I was going to tell on you, did you now? I ain't quite such a cur as that comes to, particularly when a young gent saves me from the horrors and gives me half a sovereign. I'll see you through. You make yourself easy about that." End of section 17. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas.
Section 18 of Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. Chapter 16, Hard Pressed, Part 2. Half an hour went slowly by for Mr. Bultitude in his darkness and solitude. The platform gradually filled, as he could tell by the tread of feet, the voices and the scent of cigars, and at last, welcome sound, he heard the station bell ringing for the up train. It ran in the next minute, shaking the cupboards in which Paul crouched till the brushes rattled. There was the usual blind hurry and confusion outside as it stopped. Paul waited impatiently inside. The time passed and still no one came to let him out. He began to grow alarmed. Could Tommy have forgotten him? Had he been sent away by some evil chance at the critical moment? 2 or 3 times his excited fancy heard the fatal whistle sound for departure. Would he be left behind after all? But the next instant the door was noiselessly unlocked. "Couldn't do it afore," said honest Tommy. "Our governor would have seen me. Now's your time. Here's a empty first-class coach I've kept for ye. In with you now." He hoisted Paul up the high footboard to an empty compartment and shut the door, leaving him to sink down on the luxurious cushions in speechless and measureless content. But Tommy had hardly done so before he reappeared and looked in. "I say," he suggested, "if I was you, I'd get under the seat before you gets to Dufferton. Otherways your governor'll be spotting you. I'll lock you in." "I'll get under now. Someone might see me here," said Paul, and, too anxious for safety to thank his preserver, he crawled under the low blue cushioned seat, which left just room enough for him to lie there in a very cramped and uncomfortable position. Still, he need not stay there after the train had once started, except for 5 minutes or so at Dufferton. Unfortunately, he had not been long under the seat before he heard two loud, imperious voices just outside the carriage door. "Porter! Guard! Hey, somebody! Open this door, will you? It's locked." "This way, sir," he heard Tommy's voice say outside. "Plenty of room higher up." "I don't want to go higher up. I'll go here. Just open it at once, I tell you." The door was opened reluctantly, and two middle-aged men came in. "Always take the middle carriage of a train," said the first. "Safest in any accident, you know. Never heard of a middle carriage of a train getting smashed up, to speak of." The other sat heavily down just over Paul with an uncomfortable grunt, and the train started. Paul, feeling naturally annoyed by this intrusion, as it compelled him to remain in seclusion for the whole of the journey. Still, he thought, it is lucky that I had time to get under here before they came in. It would have seemed odd if I had done it afterwards, and he resigned himself to listen to the conversation which followed. "What was it we were talking about just now?" began the first. "Let me see. I remember. Yes, it was a very painful thing, very indeed, I assure you. There is a certain peculiar and uncomfortable suspicion that attacks most of us at times, which cannot fairly be set down wholly to self-consciousness or an exaggerated idea of our own importance. I mean the suspicion that a partly heard conversation must have ourselves for its subject. More often than not, of course, it proves utterly unfounded, but once in a way, like most presentiments, it finds itself unpleasantly fulfilled. Mr. Bultitude, though he failed to recognize either of the voices, was somehow persuaded that the conversation had something to do with himself, and listened with eager attention. "Yes," the speaker continued, "he was never, according to what I hear, a man of any extraordinary capacity, but he was always spoken of as a man of standing in the city, doing a safe business, not a risky one, and so on, you know, so of course his manner when I called shocked me all the more." "Ah," said the other, "was he violent or insulting then?" "No, no, I can only describe his conduct as eccentric. What one might call reprehensibly eccentric and extravagant. I didn't call exactly in the way of business, but about a poor young fellow in my house, who is, I fear, rather far gone in consumption, and knowing he was a life governor, you know, I thought he might give me a letter for the hospital. Well, when I got up to Mincing Lane—" Paul started. It was as he feared, then they were speaking of him. "When I got there, I sent in my card with a message that, if he was engaged or anything, I would take the liberty of calling at his private house, and so on. But they said he would see me. The clerk who showed me in said, 'You'll find him a good deal changed, if you knew him, sir. We're very uneasy about him here,' which prepared me for something out of the common. Well, I went into a sort of inner room, and there he was, in his shirt sleeves, busy over some abomination he was cooking at the stove, with the office boy helping him. I never was so taken aback in my life. I said something about calling another time. But Bultitude—" Paul groaned. The blow had fallen. Well, it was better to be prepared and know the worst. "Bultitude says, just like a great awkward schoolboy, you know, 'What's your name? How d'ye do? Have some hardbake. It's just done.' Fancy finding a man in his position cooking toffee in the middle of the day and offering it to a perfect stranger." Softening of the brain must be, said the other. I fear so. Well, he asked what I wanted, and I told him, and he actually said he never did any business now, except sign his name where his clerks told him. He worked hard all his life, he said, and he was tired of it. Business was, I understood him to say, all rot. Then he wouldn't promise me votes or give me a letter or anything without consulting his head clerk. He seemed to know nothing whatever about it himself. And when that was over, he asked me a quantity of frivolous questions, which appeared to have a sort of a catch in them, as far as I could gather, and he was exceedingly angry when I wouldn't humor him. What kind of questions? Well, really, I hardly know. I believe he wanted to know whether I would rather be a bigger fool than I looked or looked a bigger fool than I was. And he pressed me quite earnestly to repeat some foolishness after him about being a gold key, when he said he was a gold lock. I was very glad to get away from him. It was so distressing. They tell me he has begun to speculate too lately, said the other. You see his name about in some very queer things. It's a pitiful affair altogether. Paul writhed under his seat with shame. How could he, even if he succeeded in ousting Dick and getting back his old self, how could he ever hold up his head again after this? Why, Dick must be mad. Even a schoolboy would have had more caution when so much depended on it. But none would suspect the real cause of the change. These horrible tales were no doubt being circulated everywhere. The conversation fell back into a less personal channel again after this. They talked of risks of someone who had only been writing a year and was doing 7,000 a week, of losses they had been on, and of the uselessness of writing 500 on everything, and while at this point the train slackened and stopped. They had reached Dufferton. There was an opening of doors all along the train, and sounds of some inquiry and answers at each. The voices became audible at length, and, as he expected, Paul found that the doctor, not having discovered him on the platform, was making a systematic search of the train, evidently believing that he had managed to slip in somewhere unobserved. It was a horrible moment when the door of his compartment was flung open and a stream of ice-cold air rushed under the blue cloth which, fortunately for Paul, hung down almost to the floor. Someone held a lantern up outside, and by its rays Paul saw from behind the hanging the upper half of Dr. Grimstone appear, very pale and polite, at the doorway. He remained there for some moments without speaking, carefully examining every corner of the compartment. The two men on the seat drew their wraps about them and shivered, until at length one said rather testily, "Get in, sir. Kindly get in if you're coming on, please. This draught is most unpleasant." "I do not propose to travel by this train, sir," said the doctor, "but as a person entrusted with the care of youth, permit me to inquire whether you have seen, or, it may be assisted to conceal, a small boy of intelligent appearance." "Why should we conceal small boys of intelligent appearance about us, pray?" demanded the man who had described his visit to Mincing Lane. "And may we ask you to shut that door and make any communications you wish to make through the window, or else come in and sit down?" "That's not an answer to my question, sir," retorted the doctor. "I notice you carefully decline to say whether you have seen a boy." "I consider your manner suspicious, sir, and I shall insist on searching this carriage through and through till I find that boy." Mr. Bultitude rolled himself up close against the partition at these awful words. "Guard! Guard!" shouted the first gentleman. "Come here. Here's a violent person who will search this carriage for something he has lost. I won't be inconvenienced in this way without any reason whatever. He says we're hiding a boy in here." "Guard," said the doctor, quite as angrily, "I insist upon looking under these seats before you start the train. I've looked through every other carriage, and he must be in here. Gentlemen, let me pass. I'll get him if I have to travel in this compartment to town with you." "For peace and quietness' sake, gentlemen," said the guard, "let him look around, just to ease his mind. Lend me your stick a minute, sir, please. I'll turn him out if he's anywhere about this here compartment." And with this he pulled Dr. Grimstone down from the footboard and mounted it himself, after which he began to rummage about under the seats with the doctor's heavy stick. Every lunge found out some tender part in Mr. Bultitude's person and caused him exquisite torture, but he clenched his teeth hard to prevent a sound, while he thought each fresh dig must betray his whereabouts. "There," said the guard at last, "there really ain't no one there, sir. You see, I've felt everywhere and... Hello, I certainly did feel something just then, gentlemen," he added, in an undertone, after a lunge which took all the breath out of Paul's body. All was lost now. "You touch that again with that confounded stick if you dare," said one of the passengers. "That's a parcel of mine. I won't have you poking holes through it in that way. Don't tell that lunatic behind you he'll be wanting to open it to see if his boy's inside. Now perhaps you'll let us alone." "Well, sir," said the guard at last to the doctor as he withdrew, "he ain't in there. There's nothing under any of the seats. Your boy'll be coming on the next train most likely, the 8:40. We're all behind, right?" "Good night, sir," said the first passenger as he leaned out of the window to the baffled schoolmaster on the platform. "You've put us all to this inconvenience for nothing, and in the most offensive way too. I hope you won't find your boy till you're in a better temper, for his sake." "If I had you out on this platform, sir," shouted the angry doctor, "I'd horsewhip you for that insult. I believe the boy's there, and you know it. But the train swept off, and, to Paul's joy and thankfulness, soon left the doctor, gesticulating and threatening, miles behind it. "What a violent fellow for a schoolmaster, eh?" said one of Paul's companions, when they were fairly off again. "I wasn't going to have him turning the cushions inside out here. We shouldn't have settled down again before we got in." "No, and if the guard hasn't, as it is, injured the Indian shawl in my parcel, I shall be... Why, bless my soul, that parcel's not under the seat after all. It's up in the rack. I remember putting it there now. The guard must have fancied he felt something, and yet... Look here, Goldiecut, just feel under here with your feet. It certainly does seem as if something soft was... Eh?" Mr. Goldiecut accordingly explored Paul's ribs with his boots for some moments, which was very painful. "Upon my word," he said at last, "it really does seem very like it. It's not hard enough for a bag or a hat box. It yields distinctly when you kick it. Can you fetch it out with your umbrella, do you think? Shall we tell the guard at the next... Lord, it's coming out of its own accord. It's a dog. No, my stars, it's the boy after all." For Paul, alarmed at the suggestion about the guard, once more felt inclined to risk the worst and reveal himself. Begrimed with coal, smeared with whitewash, and covered with dust and flue, he crawled slowly out and gazed imploringly up at his fellow passengers. After the first shock of surprise, they lay back in their seats and laughed till they cried. "Why, you young rascal," they said, when they recovered breath, "you don't mean to say you've been under there the whole time?" "I have indeed," said Paul. I didn't like to come out before." "And are you the boy all this fuss was about?" "Yes, and we kept the schoolmaster off without knowing it. Why, this is splendid, capital. You're something like a boy, you little dog, you. This is the best joke I've heard for many a day." "I hope," said Paul, "I haven't inconvenienced you. I could not help it, really." "Inconvenience us? Gad, your schoolmaster came very near inconveniencing us and you too. But there, he won't trouble any of us now. To think of our swearing by all our gods there was no boy in here, and vowing that he shouldn't come in, while you were lying down there under the seat all the time. Why, it's lovely. The boy's got pluck and manners too. Shake hands, young gentlemen. You owe us no apologies. I haven't had such a laugh for many a day." "Then you won't give me up?" faltered poor Paul. "Well," said the one who was called Goldicut, and who was the jovial old gentleman with a pink face and white whiskers, "we're not exactly going to take the trouble of getting out at the next station and bringing you back to Dufferton, just to oblige that hot-tempered master of yours, you know. He hasn't been so particularly civil as to deserve that." "But if he were to telegraph and get someone to stop me at St. Pancras," said Paul nervously. "Ah, he might do that, to be sure. Sharp boy this. Well, as we've gone so far, I suppose we must go through with the business now and smuggle the young scamp past the detectives, eh, Travers?" The younger man addressed assented readily enough, for the doctor had been so unfortunate as to prejudice them both from the first by his unjustifiable suspicions, and it is to be feared that they had no scruples in helping to outwit him. Then they noticed the pitiful state Mr. Bultitude was in, and he had to give them a fair account of his escape and subsequent adventures, at which even their sympathy could not restrain delighted shouts of laughter, though Paul himself saw little enough in it at all to laugh at. They asked his name, which he thought more prudent, for various reasons, to give as Jones, and other details which I'm afraid he invented as he went on, and altogether they reached Kentish Town in a state of high satisfaction with themselves and their protégé. At Kentish Town there was one more danger to be encountered, for with the ticket collector there appeared one of the station inspectors. "Beg pardon, gentlemen," said the latter, peering curiously in, "but does that young gent in the corner happen to belong to either of you?" The white-whiskered gentleman seemed a little flustered at this downright inquiry, but the other was more equal to the occasion. "Did you hear that, Johnny, my boy?" he said to Paul, whom they had managed during the journey to brush and scrape into something approaching respectability. "They want to know if you belong to me. I suppose you'll allow a son to belong to his father to a certain extent, eh?" he asked the inspector. The man apologized for what he conceived to be a mistake. "We've orders to look out for a young gent about the size of yours, sir," he explained. "No offence meant, I'm sure," and he went away satisfied. A few minutes more and the train rolled into the terminus, under the same wide arch beneath which Paul had stood helpless and bewildered a week ago. "Now, my advice to you, young man," said Mr. Goldicut, as he put Paul into a cab and pressed a half-sovereign into his unwilling hand, "is to go straight home to Papa and tell him all about it. I dare say he won't be very hard on you. Here's my card. Refer him to me if you like. Good night, my boy. Good night, and good luck to you. Cad, the best joke I've had for years." And the cab rolled away, leaving them standing chuckling on the platform, and, as Paul found himself plunging once more into the welcome roar and rattle of London streets, he forgot the difficulties and dangers that might yet lie before him in the thought that at last he was beyond the frontier, and, for the first time since he had slipped through the playground gate, he breathed freely. End of section 18.
Section 19 of Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. Chapter 17. A Perfidious Ally. But homeward, home, what home? Had he a home? His home. He'd walked. Then down the long street, having slowly stolen, his heart foreshadowing all calamity, his eyes upon the stones, he reached his home. Paul had been careful, whilst in the hearing of his friends, to give the cabman a fictitious address. But as soon as he reached the Euston Road, he stopped the man and ordered him to put him down at the church near the south end of Westbourne Terrace, for he dared not drive up openly to his own door. At last he found himself standing safely on the pavement, looking down the long line of yellow lamps of his own terrace, only a few hundred yards from home. But though his purpose was now within easy reach, his spirits were far from high. His anxiety had returned with tenfold power. He felt no eagerness or exultation. On the contrary, the task he had set himself had never before seemed so hopeless, so insurmountable. He stood for some time by the railing of the church, which was lighted up for evening service, listening blankly to the solemn drone of the organ within, unable to summon up resolution to move from the spot and present himself to his unsuspecting family. It was a cold night with a howling wind, and high in the blue-black sky fleecy clouds were coursing swiftly along. He obliged himself to set out at last, and walked down the flags toward his house, shivering as much from nervousness as from cold. There was a dance somewhere in the terrace that evening, a large one. As far as he could see there were close ranks of carriages with blazing lamps, and he even fancied he could hear the shouts of the link boys and the whistles summoning cabs. As he came nearer, he had a hideous suspicion, which soon became a certainty, that the entertainment was at his own house. Worse still, it was of a kind and on a scale calculated to shock and horrify any prudent householder and father of a family. The balcony above the portico was positively hung with gaudy Chinese lanterns, and there were even some strange sticks and shapes up in one corner that looked suspiciously like fireworks. Fireworks in Westbourne Terrace? What would the neighbors think or do? Between the wall which separates the main road from the terrace and the street front, there were no less than 4 piano organs, playing, it is to be feared, by express invitation, and there was the usual crowd of idlers and loungers standing about by the awning stretched over the portico, listening to the music and loud laughter which came from the brilliantly lighted upper rooms. Paul remembered then too late that Barbara, in that memorable letter of hers, had mentioned a grandchildren's party as being in contemplation. Dick had held his tongue about it that morning, and he himself had not thought it was to be so soon. For an instant he felt almost inclined to turn away and give the whole thing up in sick despair, even to return to Market Rodwell and brave the doctor's anger, for how could he hope to explain matters to his family and servants, or get the Garuda stone safely into his hands again before all these guests in the whirl and tumult of an evening party? And yet he dared not, after all, go back to Crichton House. That was too terrible an alternative, and he obviously could not roam the world to any extent, a runaway schoolboy to all appearance, and with less than a sovereign in his pocket. After a short struggle, he felt he must make his way in, watch and wait, and leave the rest to chance. It was his evil fate, after all, that had led him on to make his escape on this night of all others, and had allowed him to come through so much, only to be met with these unforeseen complications just when he might have imagined the worst was over. He forced his way through the staring crowd and went down the steps into the area, for he naturally shrank from braving the front door with its crowd of footmen and hired waiters. He found the door in the basement open, which was fortunate, and slipped quietly through the pantry, intending to reach the hall by the kitchen stairs. But here another check met him. The glass door which led to the stairs happened to be shut, and he heard voices in the kitchen, which convinced him that if he wished to escape notice, he must wait quietly in the darkness until the door was opened for him, whenever that might be. The door from the pantry to the kitchen was partly open, however, and Mr. Bultitude could not avoid hearing everything that passed there, although every fresh word added to his uneasiness, until at last he would have given worlds to escape from his involuntary position of eavesdropper. There were only two persons just then in the kitchen: his cook, who, still in her working dress, was refreshing herself after her labors over the supper with a journal of some sort, and the housemaid, who in neat gala costume was engaged in fastening a pin more securely in her white cap. "They haven't given me an answer yet, Eliza," said the cook, looking up from her paper. "Lor, cook," said Eliza, "you couldn't hardly expect it, seeing you only wrote on Friday." "No more I did, Eliza. You see, it only began to come into my mind sudden like this last week. I'm sure I no more dreamt. But they've answered a lady who's been in much the same situation as me, apparently. You just hark to this a minute." And she proceeded to read from the paper. "Lady Bird, you ask us, 1. What are the signs by which you may recognize the first dawnings of your lover's affection? On so delicate a matter we are naturally averse from advising you. Your own heart must be your best guide. But perhaps we may mention a few of the most unusual and infallible symptoms." "What sort of a thing is a symptom, Eliza?" "A symptom, cook," explained Eliza, "is something wrong with the inside. Her at my last place in Cadogan Square had them uncommon bad. She was what they call aesthetical, poor young thing. Them infallible ones are always the worst." "It doesn't seem to make sense, though, Eliza," objected cook doubtfully. "Hear how it goes. Infallible symptoms. If you have truly inspired him with a genuine and lasting passion, don't he write beautiful? Passion, he will continually haunt those places in which you are most likely to be found. I couldn't tell you the times master's been down in my kitchen this last week. He will appear awkward and constrained in your presence. Anything more awkward than master I never set eyes on. He's knocked down one of the best porcelain vegetables this very afternoon. He will beg for any little favor, some trifle it may be, made by your own hand. Master's always a-asking if I've got any of those doughnuts to give away, and if granted, he will treasure them in secret with pride and rapture. I don't think master kept any of those doughnuts, though, Eliza. I saw him swallow 5, but you couldn't treasure a doughnut, not to mention. I'll make him a pincushion when I've time, and see what he does with it. If you detect all these indications of liking in the person you suspect of paying his addresses to you, you may safely reckon upon bringing him to your feet in a very short space of time. 2. Yes, fuller's earth will make them exquisitely white." "There, Eliza," said cook with some pride, when she had finished. "If it had been meant for me, it couldn't have been clearer. Ain't it written nice? And only to think of my bringing master to my feet. It seems almost too much for a cook to expect." "I wouldn't say so, cook, I wouldn't. Have some proper pride. Don't let him think he's only to ask and have. Why, in the London Journal last week there was a duke as married a governess, and I should hope as a cook ranked above a governess." "Nor master ain't a duke. He's only in the city. But are you sure he's not only a trifling with your affections, cook? He's been very affable and pleasant with all of us lately." "It ain't for me to speak too positive, Eliza," said cook almost bashfully, "nor to lay bare the feelings of a bosom beyond what's right and proper. You're young yet, Eliza, and don't understand these things. Leastways, it's to be hoped not." Eliza having apparently tossed her head. "But do you remember that afternoon last week, as master stayed at home, a-playing games with the children? I was a-going upstairs to fetch my thimble, and there on the bedroom landing was master all alone, with one of Master Dick's toy guns in his hand, and an old slouch hat on his head. 'Have you got a pass, cook?' he says, and my heart came right up into my mouth. He looked that severe and lofty at me. I thought he was put out about something. I said I didn't know as it was required, but I could get one, I says, not knowing what he was alluding to all the same. But he says, quite soft and tender like," here Paul shivered with shame, "no, you needn't do that, cook. There ain't any occasion for it. Only," he says, "if you haven't got no pass, you'll have to give me a kiss, you know, cook." I thought I should have sunk through the stairs, I was that overcome. I saw through his rogue with half an eye. "Why, he said the same to me," said Eliza, "only I had a pass, as luck had it, which Miss Barbara give me. I'd have boxed his ears if he had tried it too, master or no master." "You talk light, Eliza," said the cook sentimentally, "but you weren't there to see. It wasn't only the words, it was the way he said it, and the hug he gave me at the time. It was as good as a proposal, and I tell you, whatever you may say, and mark my words, I have hopes." "Then if I was you, cook," said Eliza, "I'd try if I could get him to speak out plain in writing. Then, whatever came of it, there'd be as good as £500 in your pockets." "Love letters!" cried the cook. "Why, Lord love you, Eliza! Why, William, how you made me jump! I thought you was up seeing to the supper table." "The pastry cook's man is looking after all that, Jane," said Bolar's voice. "I've been up outside the drawing-room all this time, looking at the games going on in there. It's as good as a play to see the way as master is an unbending of himself, and such an out-and-out stiff one he used to be, too. But it ain't what I like to see in a respectable house. I'm glad I give warning. It doesn't do for a man in my position to compromise his character by such goings-on. I never seen anything like it in any families I've lived with before. Just come up and see for yourself. You needn't mind about cleaning of yourself. They won't see you." So the cook allowed herself to be persuaded by Bolar, and the two went up the hall, and to Mr. Bultitude's intense relief, forgot to close the glazed door which cut him off from the staircase. As he followed them upstairs at a cautious interval, and thought over what he had just so unwillingly overheard, he felt as one who had just been subjected to a moral shower bath. "That dreadful woman," he groaned. "Who would have dreamed that she would get such horrible ideas in her head? I shall never be able to look either of those two women in the face again. They will both have to go. And she made such excellent soup, too. I do hope that miserable Dick has not been fool enough to write to her. But no, that's too absurd." But more than ever he began to wish that he had stayed in the playground. When he reached the hall, he stood there for some moments in anxious deliberation over his best course of proceeding. His main idea was to lie in wait somewhere for Dick, and try the result of an appeal to his better feelings, to acknowledge his outcast parent, and abdicate gracefully. If that failed, and there was every reason to expect that it would fail, he must threaten to denounce him before the whole party. It would cause a considerable scandal, no doubt, and be extremely repugnant to his own feelings, but still he must do it, or frighten Dick by threatening to do it, and at all hazards he must contrive during the interview to snatch or purloin the magic stone. Without that he was practically helpless. He looked round him. The study was piled up with small boys' hats and coats, and in one corner was a kind of refined bar, where till lately a trim housemaid had been dispensing coffee and weak lemonade. She might return at any moment. He would not be safe there. nor would the dining room be more secluded, for in there was an elaborate supper being laid out by the waiters, which, as far as he could see through the crack in the door, consisted chiefly of lobsters, trifle, and pink champagne. He felt a grim joy at the sight, more than he would suffer for this night's festivities. As he stole about, with a dismal sense of the unfitness of his sneaking about his own house in this guilty fashion, he became gradually aware of the scent of a fine cigar, one of his own special cabanas. He wondered who had the impudence to trespass on his cigar chest. It could hardly be one of the children. He traced the scent to a billiard room which he had built out at the side of the house, which was a corner one, and going down to the door, opened it sharply and walked in. Comfortably embedded in the depths of a long, well-padded lounging chair, with a spirit case and 2 or 3 bottles of soda water at his elbow, sat a man who was lazily glancing through the field, with his feet resting on the mantelpiece, one on each side of the blazing fire. He was a man of about the middle size, with a face rather bronzed and reddened by climate, a nose slightly aquiline and higher in color, quick black eyes with an uneasy glance in them, bushy black whiskers, more like the antiquated Dundreary type than modern fashion permits, and a wide, flexible mouth. Paul knew him at once, though he had not seen him for some years. It was Paradine, his disreputable brother-in-law, the Uncle Marmaduke, who, by importing the mysterious Garuda stone, had brought about all these woes upon him. He noticed at once that his appearance was unusually prosperous, and that the braided smoking coat he wore over his evening clothes was new and handsome. No wonder, he thought bitterly, the fellow has been living on me for a week. He stood by the cue-rack looking at him for some time, and then he said with a cold, ironic dignity that, if he had known it, came oddly from his boyish lips, "I hope you are making yourself quite comfortable." Marmaduke put down his cigar and stared. "Uncommonly attentive and polite of you to inquire," he said at last, with a dubious smile, which showed a row of very white teeth. "Whoever you are, if it will relieve your mind at all to know, young man, I am happy to say I am tolerably comfortable, thanks." "I concluded as much," said Paul, nearly choked with rage. "You've been very nicely brought up," said Uncle Marmaduke. "I can see that at a glance. So you've come in here, like me, huh? Because the children bore you, and you want a quiet gossip over the world in general. Sit down, then, take a cigar, if you don't think it will make you very unwell. I shouldn't recommend it myself, you know, before supper, but you're a man of the world and know what's good for you. Come along, enjoy yourself till you find yourself getting queer. Then drop it." Mr. Bultitude had always detested the man. There was an underbred swagger and familiarity in his manner that made him indescribably offensive. Just now he seemed doubly detestable, and yet Paul, by a strong effort, succeeded in controlling his temper. He could not afford to make enemies just then, and objectionable as the man was, his astuteness made him a valuable ally. He determined, without considering the risk of making such a confidant, to tell him all and ask his advice and help. "Do you know me, Paradine?" "I don't think I have the privilege. You're one of Miss Barbara's numerous young friends, I suppose. And yet, now I look at you, you don't seem to be exactly got up for an evening party. There's something in your voice, too, I ought to know." "You ought," said Paul with a gulp. "My name is Paul Bultitude." "To be sure," cried Marmaduke. "By Jove! Then you're my young nephew, don't you know? I'm your lost long uncle, my boy. I am indeed. I'll excuse you from coming to my arms, however. I never was good at family embraces. But I say, you little rascal, you've never been asked to these festivities. You ought to be miles away, fast asleep in your bed at school. What in the name of wonders are you doing here?" "I've left school," said Paul. "So I perceive. Sulky because they left you out of all this, huh? Thought you'd turn up in the middle of the banquet, like the spectre bridegroom. The worms they crawled in and the worms they crawled out, huh? Well, I like your pluck, but I'm afraid you'll find they've rather an unpleasant way of laying your kind of apparitions." "Never mind about that," said Paul hurriedly. "I have something I must tell you. I've no time to lose. I'm a desperate man." "You are," Paradine assented with a loud laugh. "Oh, you are indeed a desperate man. Capital, a stern chase, huh? The schoolmaster close behind with the birch. It's quite exciting, you know, but seriously, I'm very much afraid you'll catch it." "If," began Mr. Bultitude in great embarrassment, "if I was to tell you that I was not myself at all, but somebody else, and, in fact, an entirely different person from what I seem to you to be, I suppose you would laugh." "I beg your pardon," said his brother-in-law politely. "I don't think I quite catch the idea." "When I assure you now, solemnly, as I stand here before you, that I am not the miserable boy whose form I am condemned to wear, you'll say it is incredible." "Not at all, by no means. I quite believe you. Only, really it's a mere detail, but I should rather like to know if you're not that particular boy, what other boy you may happen to be. You'll forgive my curiosity." "I am not a boy at all. I am your own unhappy brother-in-law, Paul. You don't believe me, I see." "Oh, pardon me, it's perfectly clear. You're not your own son, but your own father. It's a little confusing at first, but no doubt common enough. I'm glad you mentioned it, though." "Go on," said Paul bitterly. "Make light of it. You fancy you are being very clever, but you will find out the truth in time." "Not without external assistance, I'm afraid," said Paradine calmly. "A more awful little liar for your age I never saw." "I'm tired of this," said Paul. "Only listen to reason and common sense." "Only give me a chance." "I tell you," protested Paul earnestly, "it's the sober, awful truth. I'm not a boy. It's years since I was a boy. I'm a middle-aged man thrust into this humiliating form." "Don't say that," murmured the other. "It's an excellent fit, very becoming, I assure you." "Do you want to drive me mad with your clumsy jeers?" cried Paul. "Look at me. Do I speak, do I behave like an ordinary schoolboy?" "I really hope not, for the sake of the rising generation," said Uncle Marmaduke, chuckling at his own powers of repartee. "You are very jaunty today. You look as if you were well off," said Paul slowly. "I remember a time when a certain bill was presented to me, drawn by you, and appearing to be accepted, long before I ever saw it, by me. I consented to meet it for my poor Maria's sake, and because to disown my signature would have ruined you for life. Do you remember how you went down on your knees in my private room and swore you would reform and be a credit to your family yet? You weren't quite so well off or so jaunty then, unless I'm very much mistaken." These words had an extraordinary effect upon Uncle Marmaduke. He turned ashy white, and his quick eyes shifted restlessly as he half rose from his chair and threw away his unfinished cigar. "You young hound," he said, breathing hard and speaking under his breath, "how did you get hold of that lying story? Your father must have let it out. Why do you bring up bygones like this? You're a confounded, disagreeable little prig. Who told you to play an ill-natured trick of this sort on an uncle who may have been wild and reckless in his youth, was in fact, but who never misused his relation towards you as an uncle?" "How did I get hold of the story?" said Paul, observing the impression he had made. "Do you think if I were really a boy of 13 I should know as much about you as I do? Do you want to know more? Ask if you dare. Shall I tell you how it was you left your army coach without going up for examination? Will you have the story of your career in my old friend Parkinson's counting house, or the real reason of your trip to New York, or what it was that made your father add that codicil cutting you off with a set of engravings of the rake's progress, and a guinea to pay for framing them. I can tell you all about it, if you care to hear." "No," shrieked Paradine, "I won't listen. When you grow up, ask your father to buy you a cheap society journal. You're cut out for the editor of one. It doesn't interest me." "Do you believe my story or not?" asked Paul. "I don't know. Who could believe it?" said the other sullenly. "How can you possibly account for it?" "Do you remember giving Maria a little sandalwood box with a small stone in it?" said Paul. "I have some recollection of giving her something of that kind. A curiosity, wasn't it?" "I wish I had never seen it. That infernal stone, Paradine, has done all this to me. Did no one tell you it was supposed to have any magic power?" "Why, now I think of it, that old black rascal, Bindadun Doss, did try to humbug me with some such story. Said it was believed to be a talisman, but the secret was lost. I thought it was just his stingy way of trying to make the rubbish out as something priceless, as it ought to have been, considering all I did for the old ruffian." "You told Maria it was a talisman. Bindabun what's his name was right. It is a talisman of the deadliest sort. I'll soon convince you, if you will only hear me out." And then, in white-hot wrath and indignation, Mr. Bultitude began to tell the story I have already attempted to sketch here, dwelling bitterly on Dick's heartless selfishness and cruelty, and piteously on his own incredible sufferings, while Uncle Marmaduke, lolling back in his armchair with an attempt, which was soon abandoned, to retain a smile of amused skepticism on his face, heard him out in complete silence and with all due gravity. Indeed, Paul's manner left him no room for further unbelief. His tale, wild and improbable as it was too consistent and elaborate for any schoolboy to have invented, and besides, the imposture would have been so entirely purposeless. When his brother-in-law had come to the end of his sad story, Paradine was silent for some time. It was some relief to know that the darkest secrets of his life had not been ferreted out by a phenomenally sharp nephew. But the change in the situation was not without its drawbacks. It remained to be seen how it might affect himself. He already saw his reign in Westbourne Terrace threatened with a speedy determination, unless he played his cards well. "Well," he said at last, with a swift, keen glance at Paul, who sat anxiously waiting for his next words, "suppose I were to say that I think there may be something in this story of yours. What then? What is it you want me to do for you?" "Why," said Paul, "with all you owe to me, now you know the horrible injustice I have had to bear, you surely don't mean to say that you won't help me to right myself?" "And if I did help you, what then?" "Why, I should be able to recover all I have lost, of course," said Mr. Bultitude. He thought his brother-in-law had grown very dull. "Ah, but I mean, what's to become of me?" "You?" repeated Paul. He had not thought of that. "Well, from what I know, and what you know that I know about your past life, you can't expect me to encourage you to remain here." "No," said Uncle Marmaduke, "of course not. Very right and proper." "But," said Paul, willing to make all reasonable concessions, "anything I can do to advance your prospects, such as paying your passage out to New York, you know, and so on, I should be very ready to do." "Thank you," said the other. "And even, if necessary, provide you with a small fund to start afresh upon. Honestly," said Paul, "you will not find me difficult to deal with." "It's a dazzling proposition," remarked Paradine dryly. "You have such an alluring way of putting things. But the fact is, you'll hardly believe it, but I'm remarkably well off here. I am indeed. Your son, you know, though not you, except as a mere matter of form, really makes, as they say of the marmalade in the advertisements, an admirable substitute. I doubt, I do assure you, whether you yourself would have received me with quite the same warmth and hospitality I have met with from him." "So do I," said Paul, "very much." Just so, for without your admirable business capacity and extraordinary firmness of character, you know, he has, if you'll excuse my saying so, a more open, guileless nature, a more entire and touching faith in his fellow man and brother-in-law than were ever yours." "To say that to me," said Paul hotly, "is nothing less than sheer impudence." "My dear Paul, it does seem deuced odd to be talking to a little shrimp like you as a grown-up brother-in-law. I shall get used to it presently, I dare say. I flatter myself I am a man of the world. We are dealing with one another now, as the lawyers have it, at arm's length. Just put yourself in my place. You're so remarkably good at putting yourself in other people's places, you know. Look at the thing from my point of view. Accidentally dropping in at your offices to negotiate, if I could, a small temporary loan from anyone I chanced to meet on the premises, I find myself, to my surprise, welcomed with effusion into what I then imagined to be your arms. More than that, I was invited here for an indefinite time, all my little eccentricities unmentioned, overlooked. I was deeply touched. It struck me, I confess, at one time that you must be touched too, but I made the best use of my opportunities. I made hay while the sun shone." "Do you mean to make me lose my temper?" interrupted Paul. "It will not take much more." "I have no objection. I find men as a rule easier to deal with when they have once lost their temper. Their heads so often go too. But to return, a man with nerve and his fair share of brains, like myself, only wants a capitalist. He need not be a millionaire at his back to conquer the world. It's not by any means my first campaign, and I've had my reverses, but I see victory in my grasp, sir, in my grasp at last." Paul groaned. "Now it's not your fault, I know, a mere defect of constitution, but you, as a speculator, were, if I may venture to put it so, not worth your salt. No boldness, no dash, all caution. But your promising son is a regular whale on speculation, and I may tell you that we stand in together in some little ventures that would very probably make your hair stand on end. You wouldn't have touched them, and yet there's money in every one of them." "My money," said Paul savagely, "and it won't come out again." "You don't know much about these things, you see," said Marmaduke. "I tell you I have my eye on some fine openings for capital." "Your pockets always were very fine openings for capital," retorted Paul. "Ha! Deuced sharp that. But to come to the point, you were always a sensible, practical kind of fellow, and you must see that for me to back you up and upset this young rascal who has stepped into your slippers might be morally meritorious enough, but treating it from a purely pecuniary point of view, it's not business." "I see," said Mr. Bultitude heavily. "Then you side against me?" "Did I ever say I would side against you? Let us hear first what you propose to do." Paul, upon this, explained that, as he believed the stone still retained its power of granting one wish to any other person who happened to get hold of it, his idea was to get possession of it somehow from Dick, who probably would have it about him somewhere, and then pass it on to someone whom he could trust not to misuse it so basely. "A good idea that, Paul, my boy," said Paradine, smiling. "But you don't imagine our young friend would be quite such an idiot as not to see your game. Why, he would pitch the stone in the gutter or stamp it to powder rather than let you get a hold of it." "He's quite capable of it," said Paul. "In fact, he's threatened to do worse than that. I doubt if I shall ever be able to manage it myself. But what am I to do? I must try, and I've no time to lose about it either." "I'll tell you this," said Marmaduke. "If you let him see you here, it's all up with you. What you want is some friend to manage this for you, someone he won't suspect. Now suppose I were willing to risk it for you." "You?" cried Paul, with involuntary distrust. "Why not?" said Marmaduke, with a touch of feelings. "Ah, I see. You can't trust me. You've got an idea into your head that I'm a thorough-paced rascal, without a trace of human feelings about me. I dare say I deserve it. I dare say I do. But it's not generous, my boy, for all that. I hope to show you your mistake yet, if you give me the chance. You allow yourself to be prejudiced by the past. That's where you make your mistake. I only put before you, clearly and plainly, what it was I was giving up in helping you. A fellow may have a hard, cynical kind of way of putting things, and yet, take my word for it, Paul, have a heart as tender as a spring chicken underneath. I believe I'm something like that myself. I tell you I'm sorry for you. I don't like to see a family man of your position in such a regular deuce of a hole. I feel bound to give you a lift out of it, and let my prospects take their own chance. I'll leave the gratitude to you. When I'm done, kick me down the doorsteps if you like. I shall go out into the world with the glow of self-approval and rapid motion warming my system. Take my advice. Don't attempt to tackle Master Dick yourself. Leave him to me. If I could only make up my mind to trust you, muttered Paul. The old distrust, cried Marmaduke. You can't forget. You won't believe a poor devil like me can have any gratitude, any disinterestedness left in him. Never mind. I'll go. I'll leave it to you. I'll send Dick in here, and we shall see whether he's such a fool as you think him. No, said Paul, no. I feel you're right. That would never do. It would be for my advantage, I think, said the other, but you had better take me while I'm in the magnanimous mood. The opportunity may never occur again. Come, am I to help you or not? Yes or no? I must accept, said Paul reluctantly. I can't find Bowler now, and it might take hours to make him see what I wanted. I'll trust to your honor. What shall I do? Do? Get away from this. He'll be coming in here very soon to see me. Run away and play with the children, or hide in the china closet. Anything but stay here. I must be here while you're managing him, objected Paul. Nonsense, said Paradine angrily. I tell you it will spoil all, unless... Who's that? It's his step. Too late now, dash it all. Behind that screen. Quick. Don't move for your life till I tell you you may come out. Mr. Bultitude had no choice. There was just time to set up an old folding screen which stood in the corner of the room and slip behind it before the door opened. It might not be the highest wisdom to trust everything to his new ally in this manner, but what else could he do, except stand by in forced inactivity while the momentous duel was being fought out? Just then, at all events, he saw no other course. End of section 19. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas.
Section 20 of Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. Chapter 18. Run to Earth. There is noon in this house skuld bind me this night. The coax tail of Gamelin. Dick burst open the door of the billiard-room rather suddenly, and then stood holding on to the handle and smiling down upon his relative in a happy and affectionate but rather weak manner.
"So here you are," he said. "Been looking for you everywhere. What's good of shutting self in here? Come up and play games, no? Come in and have supper. I've had supper."
"So I perceive," observed Uncle Marmaduke, and the fact was certainly obvious enough.
"Tell you what I did,"
giggled the wretched Dick.
"You know, I never did get what I call regular good blowout. Always someone to say had quite enough before I began. So I thought this time I would have a tuck-in till till I felt tired, and I got down before anybody else and helped myself. I'd first go it. No one to help to things, no girls to bother. It was prime. When they've all gone up again, you and me'll go in and have some more, eh?"
"You're a model host," said his uncle.
"It's a good supper," Dick went on. "I ought to know. I've had some of everything. It's almost too good for kids, but it's a good thing I went in first. After I'd been in a little time, I saw a sponge cake on the table, and when I tried it, what do you think I found? It was as full inside of brandy and sherry as it could be. All it could do to stand. I saw directly it wasn't in condition to come to table, and I said, 'Take it away, take it away. It's drunk. It's a disgraceful sight for children.' But they wouldn't take it away, so I had to take it away. But you can't take away a whole tipsy cake."
"I'm quite sure you did your best," murmured Paradine.
"Been having some games upstairs,"
said Dick with another giggle.
"That Dolly Meredith's a jolly girl. Not so nice as Dulcie, though. Here, you, let's go up and let off fireworks on balcony, eh? Let's have jolly lark."
"No, no," said his uncle. "You and I are too old for that sort of thing. You should leave the larks to the young fellows."
"How do you know I'm too old for sort of thing?"
said Dick with an offended air. "Well, you're not a young man any longer, you know. You ought to behave like the steady old buffer you look."
"Why?"
demanded Dick.
"Why should I behave like steady old buffer when I don't feel like steady old buffer? What do you want to spoil fun for? Tell you I shall do just exactly what I like, and if you say any more, I'll punch your head."
"No, no," said his uncle, slightly alarmed at this intimation. "Come, you're not going to quarrel with me, I'm sure."
"All right," said Dick. "No, I won't quarrel. Don't want to quarrel with anybody."
"That's right," said Paradine. "I knew you were a noble fellow."
"So I am,"
said Dick, shaking hands with effusion.
"So you are. Nearly as noble as me. There, you're a jolly good fellow. I say, I've a good mind to tell you something. Make you laugh, but I won't. Not now."
"Oh, you can tell me," said Marmaduke. "No secrets between friends, you know."
"Shan't tell you now," said Dick. "Keep secret a little longer."
"Do you know, my friend, that there's something very odd about you I've noticed lately? Something that makes me almost fancy, sometimes, you're not what you pretend to be." Dick sat down heavily on one of the leather benches placed against the wall.
"Eh? What'd you say?" he gasped. "Say that again."
"You look to me," said Marmaduke slowly, "like someone excellently made up for the part of heavy father, without a notion of how to play it."
"Dick, you young dog, you see I know you. You can't take me in with all this.
You'd better tell me all about it." Dick seemed almost sobered by this shock.
"You've found me out?" he repeated dully. "Then it's all up. If you found me out, everybody else can find me out. No, no, it's not so bad as that, my boy. I've better eyes than most people. And then I had the privilege of knowing your excellent father rather well once upon a time. You haven't studied his little peculiarities closely enough, but you'll improve. By the way, where is your excellent father all this time?" "He's all right," said Dick, beginning to chuckle. "He's at school, he is." "At school? You mean to say you've put him at school at his time of life? He's rather old for that sort of thing, isn't he? They don't take him on the ordinary terms, do they?" "Ah!" said Dick. "That's where he is. He isn't old, you see, now, to look at." "Not old to look at? Then how on earth... I should like to know how you managed all that. What have you been doing to the poor gentleman?" "That's my affair," said Dick. "And if I don't tell you, you won't find that out anyway." "There's only one way you could have done it," said Paradine, pretending to hesitate. "It must have been done by some meddling with magic. Now, what... Let me see. Yes! Surely the stone I brought your poor mother from India was given to me as a talisman of some sort. You can't have been sharp enough to get hold of that." "How did you know?" cried Dick sharply. "Who told you?" "I'm right, then? Well, you are a clever fellow. I should like to know how you did it now." "Did it with the stone," said Dick, evidently discomposed by so unexpected penetration, but unable to prevent a little natural complacency. "All my own idea. No one helped me. It wasn't so bad for me, was it?" "Bad? It was capital!" cried Marmaduke enthusiastically. "It was a stroke of genius, and so my Indian stone has done all this for you. Sounds like an Arabian Night, by Jove! By the by, you don't happen to have it about you, do you? I should rather like to look at it again. It's a real curiosity after this." Paul trembled with anxiety. Would Dick be induced to part with it? If so, he was saved. But Dick looked at his uncle's outstretched hand and wagged his head with tipsy cunning. "I dare say you would," he said, "but I'm not so green as all that. Don't let that stone out of my hands for anyone." "Why, I only wanted to look at it for a minute or two," said Marmaduke. "I wouldn't hurt it or lose it." "You won't get a chance," said Dick. "Oh, very well," said Paradine carelessly. "Just as you please. It doesn't matter, though when we come to talk things over a little, you may find it better to trust me more than that." "What do you mean?" said Dick uneasily. "Well, I'll try to explain as well as I can, my boy. Drink a little of this soda water first. It's an excellent thing after supper. There, you're better now, aren't you? Now, I found you out, as you see, but only because I knew something of the powers of this stone of yours, and guessed the rest. It doesn't at all follow that other people who know nothing at all will be as sharp, if you're more careful about your behaviour in future, unless, young fellow," and here he paused meaningly. "Unless what?" asked Dick suspiciously. "Unless I choose to tell them what I found out." "What would you tell them?" said Dick. "What? Why, what I know of this talisman. Tell them to use their eyes. They wouldn't be very long before they found out that something was wrong. And when one or two of your father's friends once get hold of the idea, your game will be very soon over. You know that as well as I do."
stammered Dick. "You wouldn't go and do beastly mean thing like that. I've not been bad fellow to you." "The meanness, my dear boy, depends entirely upon the view and take of it. Now, the question with me, as a man of honour, and I may tell you an over-nice sense of honour, has been a drawback I've had to struggle against all my life. The question with me is this: is it not my plain duty to step in and put a stop to this topsy-turvy state of things? To show you up as the bare-faced young impostor you are, and restore my unhappy brother-in-law to his proper position?" "Very well expressed," thought Paul, who had been getting uncomfortable. "He has a heart, as he said, after all." "How does that seem to strike you?" added Paradine. "It strikes me as awful rot," said Dick, with refreshing candour. "It's the language of conscience, but I don't expect you to see it in the same light. I don't mind confessing to you, either, that I'm a poor devil to whom money and a safe and respectable position, all of which I have here, are great considerations, but whenever I see the finger of duty and honour and family affection all beckoning me along a particular road, I make a point of obeying their monitions occasionally. I don't mean to say that I never have bottled down a back way instead, when it was made worth my while, or that I never will." "I wonder what he's driving at now," thought Paul. "I don't know about duty and honour and all that," said Dick. "My head aches. It's the noise they're making upstairs. Are you going to tell?" "The fact is, my dear boy, that when one has had a keen sense of honour in constant use for several years, it's like most other articles, apt to become a little worse for wear. Mine is not what it used to be, Dickie. That's your name, isn't it? Our powers fail as we grow old." "I don't know what you're talking about," said Dick helplessly. "Do tell me what you mean to do." "Well, then, your head is clear enough to understand this, I hope," said Paradine impatiently, "that if I did my duty and exposed you, you wouldn't be able to keep up the farce for a single hour, in spite of all your personal advantages. You know that, don't you?" "I suppose I know that," said Dick feebly. "You know, too, that if I could be induced, mind, I don't say I can, to hold my tongue and stay on here and look after you and keep you from betraying yourself by any more of these schoolboy follies, there's not much fear that anyone else will ever find out the secret." "Which are you going to do, then?" said Dick. "Suppose I say that I like you, that you have shown me more kindness in a single week than ever your respectable father has since I first made his acquaintance. Suppose I say that I am willing to let the sense of honour and duty and all the rest of it go overboard together, that we two together are a match for papa, wherever he may be, and whatever he chooses to say and do." There was a veiled defiance in his voice that seemed meant for more than Dick, and alarmed Mr. Bultitude. However, he tried to calm his uneasiness, and persuade himself that it was part of the plan. "Will you say that?" cried Dick excitedly. "On one condition, which I'll tell you by and by. Yes, I'll stand by you, my boy. I'll coach you till I make you a man of business, every bit as good as your father, and a much better man of the world. I'll show you how to realise a colossal fortune, if you only take my advice, and will pack papa off to some place abroad, where he'll have no holidays and give no trouble." "No," said Dick firmly, "I won't have that. After all, he's my governor." "Do what you like with him, then. He can't do much harm." I tell you, I'll do all this on one condition. It's a very simple one."
"What is it?"
asked Dick. "This. You have, somewhere or other, the stone that has done all this for you. You may have it about you at this very moment. Ah?" As Dick made a sudden movement towards his white waistcoat. "I thought so. Well, I want that stone. You were afraid to leave it in my hands for a minute or two just now. You must trust me with it altogether." Paul was relieved, of course. This was merely an artifice to recover the Garuda stone, and Marmaduke was not playing him false after all. He waited breathlessly for Dick's answer.
"No," said Dick, "I can't do that. I want it too."
"Why, man, what use is it to you? It only gives you one wish. You can't use it again." Dick mumbled something about his being ill, and Barbara wishing him well again. "I suppose I can do that as well as Barbara," said his uncle. "Come, don't be obstinate. Give me the stone. It's very important that it should be in safe hands."
"No,"
said Dick obstinately. He was fumbling all the time irresolutely in his pockets.
"I mean to keep it myself."
"Very well, then. I have done with you. To-morrow morning I shall step up to Mincing Lane, and then to your father's solicitor. I think his offices are in Bedford Row, but I can easily find out at your father's place. After that, young man, you'll have a very short time to amuse yourself in, so make the best of it."
"No, don't leave me. Let me alone for a minute,"
pleaded Dick, still fumbling. At this, a sudden suspicion of his brother-in-law's moves for wishing to get the stone into his own hands overcame all Paul's prudence. If he was so clever in deceiving Dick, might he not be cheating him too, just as completely? He could wait no longer, but burst from behind the screen and rushed in between the pair.
"Go back!"
screamed Paradine.
"You infernal old idiot! You ruined everything." "I won't go back," said Paul. "I don't believe in you. I'll hide no longer. Dick, I forbid you to trust that man."
Dick had risen in horror at the sudden apparition, and staggered back against the wall, where he stood staring stupidly at his unfortunate father with fixed and vacant eyes.
"Badly as you've treated me, I'd rather trust you than that shifty, plausible fellow there. Just look at me, Dick, and then say if you can let this cruelty go on. If you knew all I've suffered since I have been among those infernal boys, you would pity me. You would indeed. If you send me back there again, it will kill me. You know as well as I do that it is worse for me than ever it could be for you. You can't really justify yourself because of a thoughtless wish of mine, spoken without the least intention of being taken at my word. Dick, I may not have shown as much affection for you as I might have done, but I don't think I deserve all this. Be generous with me now, and I swear you will never regret it."
Dick's lips moved. There really was something like pity and repentance in his face, muddled and dazed as his general expression was by his recent overindulgence, but he said nothing.
"Give Papa the stone by all means," sneered Paradine. "If you do, he will find someone to wish the pair of you back again, and then back you go to school again, the laughing stock of everybody. You silly young cub!" "Don't listen to him, Dick," urged Paul. "Give it to me, for heaven's sake. If you let him have it, he'll use it to ruin us all."
But Dick turned his white face to the rival claimants, and said, getting the words out with difficulty,
"Papa, I'm sorry. It is a shame. If I had the stone, I really would give it you, upon my word and honour I would. But now I can't ever give it up to you. It's gone. Lost."
"Lost!" cried Marmaduke. "When? Where? When did you last recollect seeing it? You must know." is morning," said Dick, twirling his chain, where part of the cheap gilt fastening still hung. "No, afternoon. I don't know," he added helplessly. Paul sank down on a chair with a heart-broken groan. A moment ago he had felt himself very near his goal. He had regained something of his old influence over Dick. He had actually managed to touch his heart, and now it was all in vain. Paradine's jaw fell. He too had had his dreams of doing wonderful things with the talisman, after he had cajoled Dick to part with it. Whether the restoration of his brother-in-law formed any part of his programme, it is better, perhaps, not to inquire. His dreams were scattered now. The stone might be anywhere, buried in London mud, lying on railway ballast, or ground to powder by cartwheels. There was little chance, indeed, that even the most liberal rewards would lead to discovery. He swore long and comprehensively. As for Mr. Bultitude, he sat motionless in his chair, staring in dull, speechless reproach at the conscience-stricken Dick, who stood in the corner blinking and whimpering with an abject penitence, odd and painful to see in one of his portly form. The children had now apparently finished supper, for there were sounds above as of dancing, and Sir Roger de Coverley, with its rollicking, never-wearying repetition, was distinctly audible above the din and laughter. Once before, a week ago that very day, had that heartless piano mocked him with its untimely gaiety. But things were not at their worst even yet, for while they sat like this, there was a sharp, short peal at the house bell, followed by loud and rather angry knocking. For carriages being no longer expected, the servants and waiters had now closed the front door, and left the passage for the supper-room. "The visitor's bell!" cried Paul, roused from his apathy, and he rushed to the window which commanded a side view of the portico. It might be only a servant calling for one of the children, but he feared the worst, and could not rest till he knew it. It was a rash thing to do, for as he drew the blind, he saw a large person in a heavy Inverness cloak standing on the steps, and, which was worse, the person both saw and recognised him. With fascinated horror, Mr. Bultitude saw the doctor's small grey eyes fixed angrily on him, and knew that he was hunted down at last. He turned to the other two with a sort of ghastly composure. "It's all over now," he said. "I've just seen Dr. Grimstone standing on my doorstep. He has come after me." Uncle Marmaduke gave a malicious little laugh. "I'm sorry for you, my friend," he said, "but I really can't help it." "You can," said Paul. "You can tell him what you know. You can save me." "Very poor economy, that," said Marmaduke airily. "I prefer spending to saving, always did. I have my own interests to consider, my dear Paul." "Dick," said poor Mr. Bultitude, disgusted at this exhibition of selfishness, "you said you were sorry just now. Will you tell him the truth?" But Dick was quite unnerved. He cowered away, almost crying. "I daren't," he stammered. I can't go back to the fellows like this. I'm afraid to tell him. I want to hide somewhere." And certainly he was in no condition to convince any angry schoolmaster of anything whatever, except that he was in a state very unbecoming for a head of the family. It was all over. Paul saw that too well. He dashed frantically from the fatal billiard-room, and in the hall met Bowler preparing to admit the visitor. "Don't open the door!" he screamed. "Keep him out! You mustn't let him in! It's Dr. Grimstone!" Bowler, surprised as he naturally was at his young master's unaccountable appearance and evident panic, nevertheless never moved a muscle of his face. He was one of those perfectly bred servants who, if they chanced to open the door to a ghoul or a skeleton, would merely inquire, "What name, if you please?" "I must go and ask your pa, then, Master Dick. There's time to look it upstairs while I'm gone. I won't say nothing," he added compassionately. Paul lost no time in following this suggestion, but rushed upstairs, 2 or 3 at a time, stumbling at every flight, with an invisible nightmare feeling that some invisible thing behind was trying to trip up his heels. He rushed blindly past the conservatory, which was lit up by Chinese lanterns and crowded with little Kate Greenaway maidens crowned with fantastic headdresses out of the crackers, and comparing presents with boy lovers. He upset perspiring waiters with glasses and trays, and scattered the children sitting on the stairs as he bounded on in his reckless flight, leaving crashes of glass behind him. He had no clear idea of what he meant to do. He thought of barricading himself in his bedroom and hiding in the wardrobe. He had desperate notions of getting onto the housetop by means of a step-ladder and the skylight above the nursery landing. On one point he was resolved. He would not be taken alive. Never before in this commonplace London world of ours was an unfortunate householder hunted up his own staircase in this distressing manner. Even his terror did not blind him to the extreme ignominy and injustice of his position, and below he heard the bell ringing more and more impatiently, as the doctor still remained on the wrong side of the door. In another minute he must be admitted, and then... Who will not sympathise with Mr. Bultitude as he approaches the crisis of his misfortunes? I protest, for my own part, that as I am compelled to describe him springing from step to step in wild terror, like a highly respectable chamois before some Alpine marksman, my own heart bleeds for him, and I hasten to end my distressing tale, and make the rest of it as little painful as I may, with honesty. End of chapter 18.
Section 21 of Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Hawryluk of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY. Chapter 19, The Reckoning. Poor Mr. Bultitude, springing wildly upstairs in a last desperate effort to avoid capture, had now almost reached his goal. Just above him was the nursery landing, with its little wooden gate, and near it, leaning against the wall, was a pair of kitchen steps with which he had hopes of reaching the roof, or the cistern loft, or some other safe and inaccessible place. Better a night spent on the slates among the chimney pots than a bed in that terrible No. 6 dormitory. But here, too, fate was against him. He was not more than half a dozen steps from the top, when, to his unspeakable horror, he saw a small form in a white frock and cardinal red sash come running out of the nursery, and begin to descend slowly and cautiously, clinging to the banisters with one chubby little hand. It was his youngest son, Rolly, and as soon as he saw this, he lost hope once and for all. He could not escape being recognized. The child would probably refuse to leave him, and even if he did contrive to get away from him, it would be hopeless to make Rolly understand that he was not to betray his hiding place. So he stopped on the stairs, aghast at his new misfortune, and feeling himself at the end of all his resources. Rolly knew him at once, and began to dance delightfully up and down on the stairs in his little bronze shoes. "Buzzer Dicky," he cried, "dear Buzzer Dicky, tum home to party?" "It's not Brother Dicky," said Paul miserably. "It's all a mistake." "Oh, but it is though," said Rolly. "And you don't know what Rolly's found?" "No, no," said Paul, trying to pass, which, as Rolly persisted in leaping joyously from side to side of the narrow stair, was difficult. "You shall show me another time. I'm in a hurry, my boy. I've got an appointment." "Rolly's got something better than that," observed the child. Mr. Bultitude, in spite of his terror, was too much afraid of hurting him by brushing roughly past to attempt such a thing, so he tried diplomacy. "Well, what has Rolly found? A cracker?" "No, no, better than a quacker. You guess?" "I can't guess," said Paul. "Never mind, I don't want to know." "Well then," said Rolly, "there," and he slowly unclosed a fat little fist, and in it Paul saw, with a revulsion of feeling that turned him dizzy and faint, the priceless talisman itself, the identical Garuda stone, with part of the frail gilt ring still attached to it. The fastening had probably given way during Master Dick's uproarious revels in the drawing room, and Rolly must have picked it up on the carpet shortly afterwards. "Isn't it a pity thing?" said Rolly, insisting that his treasure should be duly admired. "A very pretty thing," said his father, hoarse and panting. "But it's mine, Rolly, it's mine." And he tried to snatch it, but Rolly closed his fist over it and pouted. "It isn't yours," he said. "It's Rolly's. Rolly found it." Paul's fears rose again. Would he be wrecked in port after all? His ear, unnaturally strained, caught the sound of the front door being opened. He heard the doctor's deep voice booming faintly below, then the noise of persons ascending. "Rolly should have it then," he said perfidiously, "if he will say after me what I tell him. Say, 'I wish Papa and Brother Dick back as they were before,' Rolly." "Is it a game?" asked Rolly, his face clearing and evidently delighted with his eccentric brother Dick, who had run all the way home from school to play games with him on the staircase. "No, yes," cried Paul. "It's a very funny game, only do what I tell you. Now say, 'I wish Papa and Brother Dick back again as they were before.' I'll give you a sugar plum if you say it nicely." "What sort of sugar plum?" demanded Rolly, who inherited business instincts. "Any sort you like," almost shrieked Paul. "Oh, do get on." "Lots of sugar plums then? I forget what you told me. Oh, with Papa and there's somebody tummin' upstairs," he broke off suddenly. "Ith nurse tummin' to put me to bed. I don't want to go to bed yet." "And you shan't go to bed," cried Paul, for he too thought he heard someone. "Never mind, nurse. Finish the game." "Papa and Buzzy Dicky back again as they were before," repeated Rolly at last. "What a funny! Oh, it's Papa, Papa, and he told me it was Dicky. I'm afraid. Where'th Dicky gone to? I want Bab. Take me to Bab." For the stone had done its work once more, and this time with happier results. With a supreme relief and joy, which no one who had read this book can fail to understand, Mr. Bultitude felt that he actually was his old self again. Just when all hope seemed cut off and relief was most unlikely, the magic spell that had caused him such intolerable misery for one hideous week was reversed by the hand of his innocent child. He caught Rolly up in his arms and kissed him as he had never been kissed in his whole life before, at least by his father, and comforting him as well as he could, for the poor child had naturally received rather a severe shock, he stepped airily down the staircase which he had mounted with such different emotions 5 minutes before. On his way he could not resist going into his dressing room and assuring himself by a prolonged examination before the cheval glass that the stone had not played him some last piece of jugglery. But he found everything quite correct. He was the same formal, precise and portly person, wearing the same morning dress even as on that other Monday evening. And he went on with greater confidence. He took care, however, to stop at the first window, when he managed, after some coaxing, to persuade Rowley to give up the Garuda stone. As soon as he had it in his hands again, he opened the window wide and flung the dangerous talisman far out into the darkness. Not till then did he feel perfectly secure. He passed the groups of little guests gathered about the conservatory, and lower down he met Bowler, the nurse, and one or two servants and waiters, rushing up in a state of great anxiety and flurry. Even Bowler's usual composure seemed shaken. "Please, sir," he asked, "the schoolmaster gentleman, Master Dick. He've run upstairs. Haven't you seen him?" Paul had almost forgotten Dick in his new happiness. There would be a heavy score to settle with him. He had the upper hand once more, and yet somehow he did not feel as much righteous wrath and desire for revenge as he expected to do. "Don't be alarmed," he said, waving them back with more benignity than he had thought he had in him. "Master Dick is safe enough. I know all about it. Where is Dr. Grimstone? In the library, eh? Very well, I will see him there." And leaving Rowley with the nurse, he went down to the library, not, if the truth must be told, without a slight degree of nervousness, unreasonable and unaccountable enough now, but quite beyond his power to control. He entered the room, and there, surrounded by piles of ticketed hats and coats, under the pale light of one gas burner, he saw the terrible man before whom he had trembled for the last 7 horrible days. A feeling of self-defence made Paul assume rather more than his old stiffness as he shook hands. "I am very glad to see you, Dr. Grimstone," he said, "but your coming at this time forces me to ask if there is any unusual reason for my having the pleasure of seeing you here." "I am exceedingly distressed to have to say that there is," said the doctor solemnly, "or I should not have troubled you at this hour. Try to compose yourself, my dear sir, to bear this blow." "I will," said Paul. "I will try. The fact is then, and I know how sad a story it must be for a parent's ear, but the fact is that your unhappy boy has had the inconceivable rashness to quit my roof." And the doctor paused to watch the effect of his announcement. "God bless my soul!" cried Paul. "You don't say so!" "I do indeed. He has, in short, run away. But don't be alarmed, my dear Mr. Bultitude. I think I can assure you he is quite safe at the present moment." "Thank heaven he is," thought Paul, thinking of his own marvellous escape. "I should certainly have recaptured him before he could have left the railway station, where he seems to have gone at once, which I strongly suspect now was intentionally misleading. I drove on to the station on the up line, thinking to find him there. He was not there, sir. I believe he never went there at all. But guessing how matters were, I searched the train, carriage by carriage, compartment by compartment, when it came up." "I'm very sorry you should have had so much trouble," said Paul, with a vivid recollection of the exploring stick. "And so you found him?" "No, sir," said the doctor passionately. "I did not find him, but he was there. He must have been there, but the shameless connivance of 2 excessively ill-bred persons, who positively refused to allow me access to their compartment, caused him to slip through my fingers." Mr. Bultitude observed rather ungratefully that, if this was so, it was a most improper thing for them to do. It was indeed, but it is of no consequence, fortunately. I was forced to wait for the next train, but that was not a very slow one, and so I was able to come on here before a very late hour and acquaint you with what had taken place." "Thank you very much," said Paul. "It's a painful thing to occur in a school," observed the doctor after a pause. "Most unfortunate," agreed Paul, coughing. "So apt to lead persons who are not acquainted with the facts to imagine that the boy was unhappy under my care," continued the doctor. "In this case, I assure you, I have no doubts," protested Paul with politeness and, seldom a possible combination, perfect truth. "Very kind of you to say so, really. It's a great mystery to me. I certainly, as I felt it my duty to inform you at the time, came very near inflicting corporal punishment upon him this morning. Very near. But then he was pardoned on your intercession, and, besides, the boy would never have run away for fear of a flogging." "Oh no, perfectly absurd," agreed Paul again. "Such a merry, high-spirited lad too," said the doctor, sincerely enough. "Popular with his schoolfellows, a favourite, in spite of his faults, with his teachers." "No? Was he though?" said Paul with more surprise, for he had not been fortunate enough to reap much vicarious benefit from his son's popularity, as he could not help remembering. All this, added to the comforts, or may I say the luxuries, he enjoyed under my supervision, does make it seem very strange and ungrateful in the boy to take this sudden and ill-considered step. "Very, indeed. But do you know, Dr. Grimstone, I can't help thinking, and pray do not misunderstand me if I speak plainly, that, perhaps, he had reasons for being unhappy you can have no idea of. He would have found me ready to hear any complaints and prompt to redress them, sir," said the doctor. "But, now I think of it, he certainly did appear to have something on his mind which he wished to tell me, but his manner was so strange and he so persistently refused to come to the point that I was forced to discourage him at last." "You did discourage him, indeed," said Paul, inwardly thinking of those attempted confidences with a shudder. "Perhaps some of his schoolboys may have—" "Eh?" he said aloud. "My dear sir," exclaimed the doctor, "quite out of the question." "Do you think so?" said Paul, not being able to resist the suggestion. "And yet, do you know, some of them did not appear to me to look very, very good-natured now. A more manly, pleasant, and gentlemanly set of youths never breathed," said the doctor, taking up the cudgels for his boys, and, to do him justice, probably with full measure of belief in his statement. "Curious now that they should have struck you so differently." "They certainly did strike me very differently," said Paul, "but I may be mistaken." "You are, my dear sir, and pardon me, but you had no opportunity of testing your opinion." "Oh, pardon me," retorted Paul grimly, "I had indeed." "A cursory visit," said the doctor, "a formal inspection. You cannot fairly judge boys by that. They will naturally be reserved and constrained in the presence of an elder, but you should observe them without their knowledge. You want to know them, my dear Mr. Bultitude. You want to go among them." It was the very last thing Paul did want. He knew them quite well enough, but it was of no use to say so, and he merely assented politely. "And now," said the doctor, "with regard to your misguided boy, I have to tell you that he is here, in this very house. I tracked him here, and, 10 minutes ago, saw him with my own eyes at one of your windows." "Here!" cried Paul, with a well-executed start. "You astonish me." "It has occurred to me within the last minute," said the doctor, "that there may be a very simple explanation of his flight. I observe you are giving a juvenile entertainment on a large scale." "I suppose I am," Paul admitted. "And so you think—" "I think that your son, who doubtless knew of your intention, was hurt at being excluded from the festivities, and, in a fit of mad wilful folly, resolved to be present at them in spite of you." "My dear doctor," cried Paul, who saw the conveniences of this theory, "that must be it, of course. That explains it all." "So grave an act of insubordination," said the doctor, "an act of double disobedience to your authority and mine, deserves the fullest punishment. You agree with me, I trust." The memories of his wrongs overcame Mr. Bultitude for the moment. "Nothing can be too bad for the little scoundrel," he said between his teeth. "He shall have it, sir. I swear to you, he shall be made to repent this as long as he lives. This insult to me, and of course to you also, shall be amply atoned for, if you will have the goodness to deliver him over to my hands. I will carry him back at once to Market Rodwell, and tomorrow, sir, tomorrow, I will endeavour to awaken his conscience in a way he will remember." The doctor was more angry than an impartial lover of justice might perhaps approve of, but then it must be remembered that he had seen himself completely outwitted and his authority set at naught in a very humiliating fashion. However, his excessive wrath cooled Paul's own resentment instead of inflaming it. It made him reflect that, after all, it was he who had the best right to be angry. "Well," he said, rather coldly, "we must find him first, and then consider what shall be done to him. If you will allow me, I will ring and—" But before he could lay his hand upon the bell, the library door opened, and Uncle Marmaduke made his appearance, dragging with him the unwilling Dick. The unfortunate boy was effectually sobered now, pale and trembling and besmirched with coal dust. In fact, in very much the same plight as his ill-used father had been in only 3 hours ago. There was a brazen smile of triumph on Mr. Paradine's face as he met Paul's eyes with a knowing wink, which the latter did not at all understand. Such audacity astounded him, for he could hardly believe that Paradine, after his perfidious conduct in the billiard-room, could have the clumsy impudence to try to perpetuate him now. "Here he is, my boy," shouted Paradine. "Here's the scamp who has given us all this trouble. He came into the billiard-room just now and told me who he was, but I would have nothing to do with him, of course. Not my business, as I told him at the time. Then, I think I have the pleasure of seeing Dr. Grimstone." "Just so. Well, then you arrived, sir." "Arrived, and he made himself scarce. But when I saw him in the act of making a bolt up the area, where he had been taking shelter apparently in the coal cellar, I thought it was time to interfere, and so I collared him. I have much pleasure in handing him over now to the proper authorities." And, letting Dick go, he advanced towards his brother-in-law, still with the same odd expression of having a secret understanding with him, which made Paul's blood boil. "Stand where you are, sir," said Paul to his son. "No, Dr. Grimstone, allow me. Leave him to me for the present, please." "That's much better," whispered Paradine approvingly. "Capital! Keep it up, my boy, keep it up. Papa's as quiet as a lamb now. Go on." Then Paul understood. His worthy brother-in-law had not been present at the last transformation, and was under a slight misapprehension. He evidently imagined that he had, by this last stroke, made himself and Dick masters of the situation. It was time to undeceive him. "Have the goodness to leave my house at once, will you?" he said sternly. "You young fool," said Marmaduke under his breath. "After all I have done for you, too. Is this your gratitude? You know you can't get on without me. Take care what you're about." "If you can't see that the tables are turned at last," said Paul slowly, "you're duller knave than I take you to be." Marmaduke started back with an oath. "It's a trick," he said savagely. "You want to get rid of me." "I certainly intend to," said Paul. "Are you satisfied? Do you want proofs? Shall I give them? I did just now in the billiard room." Paradine went to Dick and shook him angrily. "You young idiot," he said in a furious aside. "Why didn't you tell me? What did you let me make a fool of myself like this for, eh?" "I did tell you," muttered Dick, "only you wouldn't listen. It just serves you right." Marmaduke soon collected himself after this unexpected shock. He tried to shake Paul's hands with an airy geniality. "Only my little joke," he said, laughing. "Ha ha! I thought it should take you in. Why, I knew it directly. I've been working for you all the time. But it wouldn't have done to let you see my line." "No," said Paul. "It was not a very straight one as usual." "Well," said Marmaduke, "I shouldn't have stopped Master Dick there if I hadn't been on your side. Should I now? I knew you'd come out of it all right, but I had a difficult game to play, don't you know? I don't wonder that you didn't follow me just at first." "You've lost your game," said Paul. "It's no use to say any more. So now perhaps you'll go." "Go, eh?" said Paradine, without showing much surprise at the failure of so very forlorn a hope. "Oh, very well, just as you please, of course. Let your poor wife's only brother go from your doors without a penny in the world. But I warn you that a trifle or so laid out in stopping my mouth would not be thrown away. Some editors would be glad enough of a sensation from real life just now, and I could tell some very odd tales about this little affair. Tell them, if a character for sanity is of no further use to you," said Paul. "Tell them to anyone you can get to believe you. Tell the crossing sweeper and the policeman. Tell your grandmother. Tell the horse marines. It will amuse them. Only you shall tell them on the other side of my front door. Shall I call anyone to show you out?" Paradine saw his game was really played out, and swaggered insolently to the door. "Not on my account, I beg," he said. "Good-bye, Paul, my boy. No more dissolving views. Good-bye, my young friend Richard. It was good fun while it lasted, eh? Like the Servian crown, always a pleasant reminiscence. Good evening to you, Doctor. By the way, for educational purposes, let me recommend a Penang lawyer. Buy one as you go back to the boys, just to show them you haven't forgotten them." And, having little luggage to impede him, the front door closed upon him shortly afterwards, this time forever. When he had gone, Dick looked imploringly at his father and then at the doctor, who, until Paradine's parting words had lashed him into fury again, had been examining the engravings on the walls with a studied delicacy during the recent painful scene, and was now leaning against the chimney-piece with his arms folded, and a sepulchral gloom on his brow. "Richard," said Mr. Bultitude in answer to the look, "you have not done much to deserve consideration at my hands." "Or at mine," added the doctor ominously. "No," said Dick, "I know I haven't. I've been a brute. I deserve a jolly good licking." "You do," said his father, but in spite of his indignation, the broken-down look of the boy and the memory of his own sensations when waiting to be caned that morning moved him to pity. And then Dick had shown some compunction in the billiard-room. He was not entirely lost to feeling. "Well," he said at last, "you've acted very wrongly. Because I thought it best that you should not leave your studies for this party, you chose to disobey me and alarm your master by defying my orders and coming home by stealth. That was your object, I presume?" "Yes," said Dick, looking rather puzzled, but seeing that he was expected to agree. "That was it." "You know as well as I do what good cause I have to be angry. But if I consent to overlook your conduct this time, If I asked Dr. Grimstone to overlook it too?" The doctor made an inarticulate protest, while Dick stared incredulous. "Will you undertake to behave better for the future? Will you?" Dick's voice broke at this, and his eyes swam. He was effectually conquered. "Oh, I will!" he cried. "I will, really. I never meant to go so far when I began." "Then, Dr. Grimstone," said Paul, "you will do me a great favour if you will take no further notice of this. You see the boy is sorry, and I am sure he will apologize to you amply for the grave slight he has done you. And by the way, I should have mentioned it before, but he will have to leave your care at the end of the term for a public school. I intend to send him to Harrow, so he will require some additional preparation. Perhaps I may leave that in your hands." Dr. Grimstone looked deeply offended, but he only said, "I will see to that myself, my dear sir. I am sorry you did not tell me this earlier. But may I suggest that a large public school has its pitfalls for a boy of your son's disposition, and I trust this leniency may not have evil consequences, but I doubt it. I greatly doubt it." As for Dick, he ran to his father and hung gratefully on his arm with a remorseful hug, a thing he had never dared to do or thought of attempting in his life till then. "Dad," he said in a choked voice, "you're a brick. I don't deserve any of it, but I'll never forget this as long as I live." Mr. Bultitude, too, felt something spring up in his heart which drew him towards the boy in an altogether novel manner, but no one will say that either was the worse for it. "Well," he said mildly, "prove to me that I have made no mistake. Go back to Crichton House now, work and play well, and try to keep out of mischief for the rest of the term. I trust to you," he added in a lower tone, "while you remain at Market Rodwell, to keep my connection with it a secret. You owe that at least to me. You may probably have some inconveniences to put up with, inconveniences you are not prepared for. You must bear them as your punishment." And soon afterwards a cab was called, and Dr. Grimstone prepared to return to Market Rodwell with the deserter by the last train. As Paul shook hands through the cab window with his prodigal son, he repeated his warning. "Mind," he said, "you have been at school all this past week. You have run away to attend this party. You understand? Good-bye, my boy, and here's something to put in your pocket, and another for Jolland. But he need not know it comes from me." And when Dick opened his hand afterwards, he found 2 half-sovereigns in it. So the cab rolled away, and Paul went up to the drawing-room, where, although he certainly allowed the fireworks on the balcony and in the garden to languish forgotten on their sticks, he led all the other revels up to the advanced hour with jovial abandon, quite worthy of Dick, and none of his little guests ever suspected the change of host. When it was all over, and the sleepy children had driven off, Paul sat down in an easy chair by the bright fire which sparkled frostily in his bedroom, to think gratefully over all the events of the day, events which were beginning already to take an unreal and fantastic shape. Bitterly as he had suffered, and in spite of the just anger and thirst for revenge with which he had returned, I am glad to say he did not regret the spirit of mildness that had stayed his hand when his hour of triumph came. His experiences, unpleasant as they had been, had had their advantages. They had drawn him and his family closer together. In his daughter Barbara, as she wished him good night, knowing nothing of course of the escape, he had suddenly become aware of a girlish freshness and a grace he had never looked for or cared to see before. Roly, after this, too, had a claim upon him he could never wish to forget, and even with the graceless Dick there was a warmer and more natural feeling on both sides, a strange result, no doubt, of such unfilial behaviour, but so it was. Mr. Bultitude would never after this consider his family as a set of troublesome and thankless encumbrances. Thanks to Dick's offices during the interregnum, they would henceforth throw off their reserve and constraint in their father's presence, and in so doing open his eyes to qualities of which he had hitherto been in contented ignorance. It would be pleasanter perhaps to take leave of Mr. Bultitude thus, as he sits by his bedroom fire in the first flush of supreme and unalloyed content. But I feel almost bound to point out a fact which few will find any difficulty in accepting, namely, that although the wrong had been retrieved without scandal or exposure, for which Paul could not be too thankful, there were many consequences which could not but survive it. Neither father nor son found himself exactly in the same position as before their exchange of characters. It took Mr. Bultitude considerable time and trouble to repair all the damage his son's boyish excesses had wrought both at Westbourne Terrace and in the city. He found the discipline of his clerk's rooms and counting-house sorely relaxed, and his office boy in particular attempted a tone towards him of such atrocious familiarity that he was indignantly dismissed, much to his astonishment, the very first day. And probably Paul will never quite clear himself of the cloud that hangs over a man of business who, in the course of however well regulated a career, is known to have been at least once a little odd. And his home, too, was distinctly demoralized. His cook was an artist, unrivalled at soups and entrees, but he had to get rid of her notwithstanding. It was only too evident that she looked upon herself as the prospective mistress of his household, and he did not feel called upon as a parent to fulfil any expectations which Dick's youthful cupboard love had unintentionally excited. For some time, as fresh proof of Dick's extravagances came home to him, Paul found it cost him no little effort to restrain a tendency to his former bitterness and resentment, but he valued the new understanding between himself and his son too highly to risk losing it again by any open reproach, and so with each succeeding discovery the victory over his feelings became easier. As for Dick, he found the inconveniences at which his father had hinted anything but imaginary, as will perhaps be easily understood. It was an unpleasant shock to discover that in one short week his father had contrived somehow to procure him a lasting unpopularity. He was obviously looked upon by all, masters and boys, as a confirmed coward and sneak. And although some of his companions could not fairly reproach him on the latter score, the imputation was particularly galling to Dick, who had always treated such practices with sturdy contempt. He was sorely tempted at times to right himself by declaring the real state of the case, but he remembered his promise and his father's unexpected clemency, and his gratitude always kept him silent. He never quite understood how it was that the whole school seemed to have an impression that they could kick and assault him generally with perfect impunity. But a few very unsuccessful experiments convinced them that this was a popular error on their part. Although, however, in everything else he did gradually succeed in recovering all the ground his father had lost him, yet there was one respect in which, I'm sorry to say, he found all his efforts to retrieve himself hopeless. His little sweetheart, with the grey eyes and soft brown hair, cruelly refused to have anything more to do with him, for Dulcie's pride had been wounded by what she considered his shameless perfidy on that memorable Saturday by the parallel bars. The last lingering traces of affection had vanished before Paul's ingratitude on the following Monday, and she never forgave him. She did not even give him an opportunity of explaining himself, never by word or sign up to the last day of the term showing that she was even aware of his return. What was worse, in her resentment she transferred her favour to Dippong, who became her humble slave for a too brief period, after which he was found wanting in polish, and was ignominiously thrown over for the shy new boy Kiffin, whose head Dick found a certain melancholy pleasure in punching in consequence. This was Dick's punishment, and a very real and heavy one he found it. He is at Harrow now, where he is doing fairly well, but I think there are moments even yet when Dulcie's charming little face, her pretty confidences, and her chilling disdain are remembered with something as nearly resembling a heartache as a healthy, unsentimental boy can allow himself. Perhaps if some day he goes back once more to Crichton House to see the fellows, this time with the mysterious glamour of a great public school about him, he may yet obtain forgiveness, for she is getting horribly tired of Kiffin, who, to tell the truth, is something of a milksop. As for the Garuda stone, I really cannot say what has become of it. Perhaps it was dashed to pieces on the cobblestones of the stables behind the terrace, and a good thing too. Perhaps it was not, and is still in existence, with all its dangerous powers as ready for use as ever it was, and in that case the best I can wish my readers is, that they may be mercifully preserved from finding it anywhere, or if they are unfortunate enough to come upon it, that they may at least be more careful with it than Mr. Paul Bultitude, by whose melancholy example I trust they will take timely warning. And with these very sincere wishes I beg to bid them a reluctant farewell. End of section 21, chapter 19. End of Vice Versa by F. ANSTEY.